Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where the strangest plans in history have a way of sounding almost reasonable once you understand the mind behind them, and where the edge of the known world has always been less a boundary than an invitation. Tonight, we're heading somewhere that most living creatures have the good sense to avoid. Somewhere that has swallowed ships whole, erased expeditions without a trace, and spent centuries resisting every human attempt to understand it. We're going north. Not just north in the way that suggests a long drive with a heater on, but north in the way that means darkness for months at a time, ice thick enough to carry mountains, and temperatures that make the air itself feel like something solid pressing against your skin. We're going to the top of the world, and we're going there aboard a wooden ship that was deliberately, intentionally, and with full scientific reasoning sailed into the ice and left there. This is the story of the Fram expedition. It ran from 1893 to 1896, and it remains one of the most extraordinary journeys any human being has ever planned, survived, and returned from to tell. At its centre was a Norwegian named Fridtjof Nansen, a man who combined the instincts of a scientist with the constitution of someone who genuinely did not seem to find extreme cold particularly discouraging. And at the centre of his plan was a paradox so elegant and so alarming that when he first proposed it, most of the exploration world responded with something close to polite horror. The plan, stated simply, was this: sail a ship into the Arctic pack ice on purpose, allow it to become frozen in place, and then wait while the ice carried it slowly across the polar basin toward the other side of the world. No engine running, no escape route, no rescue possible. Just a wooden ship, 13 men, and the quiet faith that a current moving beneath the surface of the frozen Arctic Ocean would do the rest. If that sounds either brilliant or suicidal, you're not alone in that reaction. And tonight, we're going to follow that plan from its first glimmer of an idea all the way to its almost impossible conclusion, stopping along the way to understand why the Arctic terrified explorers for centuries, how one man looked at wreckage washed up on a Greenland beach and saw a route through the most hostile place on Earth, and what it actually felt like to be one of 13 people living inside a wooden hull while the ice groaned and shifted around you in the polar dark. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something small. Where are you right now as you listen to this? What is the temperature outside your window tonight? Is there frost on the glass? Or are you somewhere warm, somewhere where the cold is only a concept, something you know about but do not currently feel pressing against your face? Whatever your answer, I can promise you this: wherever you are, it is considerably more comfortable than where we're about to spend the next little while, and I think that contrast is part of what makes this story so worth settling into. If you find yourself enjoying this kind of quiet, careful storytelling, I would be genuinely grateful if you took a moment to like this video and subscribe to Life Beyond Seen. It is a small thing that makes a real difference in helping this channel reach more people who might be looking for exactly this kind of calm, curious company at the end of a long day. And now, with that said, let us begin. There is an image that sits at the heart of this story, and it is worth holding in your mind before anything else. Picture a wooden ship locked in Arctic sea ice, not sinking. Not damaged, not caught by accident in the wrong place at the wrong time, just sitting there, held in place by several million tons of frozen ocean, its hull rising slightly as the pressure builds around it, its flag hanging still in air so cold that breath turns to ice crystals before it can travel half a metre. The ship is not going anywhere. And the remarkable thing is that this is exactly what the man who designed the voyage intended. The ship is waiting. It is doing precisely what it was built and sailed there to do. That ship was called the Fram, which is a Norwegian word meaning forward, and in the autumn of 1893, somewhere north of the Siberian coastline at roughly 78 degrees and 50 minutes north latitude, it settled into the ice and began the most unusual voyage in the history of polar exploration. No sails, no engine, no crew member at the helm. Just a ship drifting with the current that Fridtjof Nansen believed with quiet and careful conviction, was moving through the polar basin from east to west, from the waters north of Siberia toward the open sea above Greenland. To understand why this was considered either visionary or reckless, depending on who you asked, you have to understand the world that Nansen was operating in. The year was 1893. The late 19th century was the great age of exploration in the modern sense, a period when European and American nations were pouring money, ships and men into the project of reaching places that had never been reached. The South Pole had not yet been claimed, the source of the Nile had only recently been settled, and the North Pole, that invisible point at the top of the globe where all lines of longitude converge and the compass needle loses its sense of direction, remained completely untouched by human hands. No one had ever stood there. No one had even come particularly close. The farthest north any documented expedition had reached was 83 degrees and 24 minutes north, a record set by the crew of the USS Jeannette in 1882, and that expedition had ended in catastrophe. The North Pole in the late 19th century was not just a geographic challenge, it was a matter of national pride, scientific prestige, and a kind of romantic obsession that is difficult to fully translate into modern terms. Nations measured themselves partly by how far their explorers had gone. Records were announced in newspapers, expeditions were celebrated like military victories. And the pole, that final unreachable point, sat at the top of all of it, waiting for whoever was brave enough, or well-funded enough, or perhaps simply stubborn enough to get there first. Nansen was 31 years old when he first began seriously developing his polar drift theory. He was already famous in Norway, and not just for scientific work. In 1888, 5 years before the Fram expedition departed, he had led the first crossing of the Greenland ice sheet on skis, a journey of roughly 500 kilometres across terrain that most people considered impassable. He was a zoologist by training, a skier by nature, and a thinker who had the somewhat inconvenient habit of following an idea wherever it led, even when it led somewhere that made his colleagues deeply uncomfortable. The idea that would become the Fram expedition was not born in a laboratory or a planning meeting. It began with a piece of wreckage on a beach, but that is a story that belongs to the next part of this journey, and it is the kind of detail that changes everything once you understand it properly. For now it is enough to sit with the image we started with, a ship in the ice, a Norwegian flag barely moving in the polar wind. 13 men inside, eating dinner, playing cards, taking scientific measurements, waiting with a patience that most of us will never be asked to summon in our lives. And somewhere in the thinking of the man who put them there, a theory about the way the Arctic Ocean moves, a theory built on drifting debris and careful reasoning, that he was willing to stake his ship, his crew, and his own life on. What Nansen understood, in a way that almost no one else in his era did, was that the Arctic was not simply an obstacle. It was not a wall to be broken through or a wilderness to be conquered by brute force. It was a system. It had currents, patterns, a logic of its own that could be read if you were willing to look at it the right way. And if you could read it correctly, you did not need to fight the Arctic. You could let it carry you. That insight sounds almost simple when you say it out loud. But in the context of 1893, when the Arctic had already killed hundreds of men and crushed dozens of ships, when the dominant approach to polar exploration was essentially to sail north as hard as possible and hope for the best, Nansen's willingness to trust the ocean's own movement rather than fight it was genuinely radical. It was the difference between understanding a river and trying to walk upstream through it. The world he was proposing to enter had a long and terrible reputation, and that reputation was entirely deserved. The Arctic had not merely inconvenienced previous explorers, it had erased them. It had taken their ships, their supplies, their confidence, and in many cases their lives, and left almost nothing behind to explain what had gone wrong. The history of Arctic exploration before Nansen was in many ways a history of loss. And it is that history, that long catalogue of failed attempts and frozen disasters, that makes what Nansen was proposing so extraordinary to consider. He was not unaware of what had happened to the men who went before him. He had read every account. He knew the names of the ships and the years and the terrible outcomes, and he went anyway, not because he was reckless, but because he believed he had finally understood something that those earlier expeditions had not. Whether that belief was correct was something that would take 3 years, 13 lives held in careful balance, and one of the most dramatic survival stories in the history of human endurance to answer. And we're only just beginning to follow it north. To understand what Nansen was walking into, you have to spend a little time with the record. Not just the broad strokes of it, but the specific, documented human weight of what the Arctic had already done to the people who tried to reach it. Because it was not a vague danger. It was not the kind of risk that could be waved away with optimism and good equipment. The Arctic had a history, and that history was written in ships that never came home. The most famous of those ships, the ones whose names had lodged themselves permanently into the collective memory of the exploration world by the time Nansen began planning his voyage, were HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. 2 vessels, well built and well supplied, dispatched in May of 1845 under the command of Sir John Franklin, a British Royal Navy officer with decades of Arctic experience behind him. The expedition carried 129 men, enough food for 3 years, a small library, and the confident expectation that they would find the Northwest Passage, that long-sought navigable route through the Arctic waters north of Canada. They were seen by a whaling crew in late July of 1845 somewhere in Baffin Bay, the ship still intact, the men still healthy, the mission apparently proceeding as planned. After that, silence. No messages came back, no ships returned. The Arctic simply swallowed them. Both vessels and all 129 men disappeared so completely that it took more than a decade of search expeditions, some of them themselves nearly disastrous, to piece together what had happened. What eventually emerged through the discovery of a written note left under a cairn on King William Island and the grim evidence of human remains and scattered artefacts was a story of ships locked in ice for nearly 2 years, of Franklin dying in June 1847, of the survivors abandoning the vessels in April 1848 and attempting to walk south towards safety, and of every single one of them dying before reaching it. Some accounts, supported by analysis of bones found decades later, suggest the men were weakened by lead poisoning from the soldered tins of their own food supply. Others point to scurvy, starvation, and the simple, brutal arithmetic of a cold that never relented. Whatever the precise combination, the outcome was total. 129 men, 0 survivors. That disaster did not stop the attempts. If anything, it intensified them, partly because the search for Franklin became its own series of expeditions, and partly because the pole itself remained untouched and therefore irresistible. Through the 1850s, 1860s and 1870s, ship after ship pushed north. Some made progress, most did not. Several barely returned at all. The pattern that emerged from these attempts was consistent and grim. Ships would sail north until the ice stopped them. They would become trapped. The pressure of the ice would build against their hulls. And then, depending on the ship's construction and the particular cruelty of that season's freeze, the vessel would either survive the winter and attempt to break free in spring, or it would be slowly, methodically destroyed. Ice is not a passive substance when it moves. Pack ice in the Arctic can exert pressures measured in tons per square metre. It does not simply hold a ship still. It squeezes, it shifts. It can lift a vessel completely out of the water, tilting it at angles that make the interior unlivable, and then set it back down. Or it can crush inward against the hull until the planks splinter, and the water comes in, and there is nothing left to do but abandon ship and walk across the ice toward whatever shore might exist within reach. The concept that drove so many of these expeditions into danger was not simple greed or recklessness. There was a genuine scientific theory behind the push northward, one that had been circulating in geographical and naval circles for much of the 19th century. It was called the Open Polar Sea. The idea, promoted seriously by respected figures including the American explorer Elisha Kent Kane and the geographer August Peterman, held that beyond the ring of pack ice that surrounded the Arctic basin, there existed a warm, navigable open ocean near the pole itself. The reasoning was not entirely absurd. Some explorers had reported seeing open water to the north after pushing through heavy ice. Certain species of birds and marine animals seemed to migrate northward in summer. There were temperature anomalies that seemed, to some observers, to suggest warmth somewhere beyond the visible horizon. The theory was wrong, as it turned out, deeply and completely wrong, but it was wrong in a way that took lives to disprove. Because if you believed in the open polar sea, then the strategy was clear. You pushed through the ice belt, you found the open water, and you sailed to the pole across a calm, navigable surface. All you had to do was get through the ice first. That belief sent ships and men directly into the most dangerous conditions the Arctic could offer, chasing a warmth that did not exist. By the 1880s, the open polar sea theory was beginning to lose credibility, but the expeditions kept coming, and it was one of those expeditions, one of the ones that ended in disaster, that would eventually give Nansen the key to his entire plan. The USS Jeannette was an American naval vessel, dispatched in 1879 under the command of Lieutenant Commander George Washington DeLong, with the backing of the newspaper publisher James Gordon Bennett Jr., and the goal of reaching the North Pole by sailing north through the Bering Strait. The ship entered the Arctic ice in September of 1879 and was immediately trapped. For nearly 2 years it drifted helplessly, carried by the ice in directions DeLong could not control and often could not predict. The crew endured 2 Arctic winters locked in the pack, watching the ice press against the hull, conducting what scientific observations they could, and waiting with diminishing hope for a release that did not come. In June of 1881, the ice finally delivered its verdict. The Jeannette was crushed. The hull gave way, the ship sank, and DeLong and his men were left standing on the ice north of the New Siberian Islands, roughly 155 kilometers from land, with 3 small boats and whatever supplies they had managed to save. They dragged the boats across the ice and eventually reached open water, then attempted to sail south toward the Siberian coast. The 3 boats became separated in a storm. One, carrying 12 men including the engineer George Melville, reached shore and survived. The second boat with 11 men was never seen again. The third, carrying DeLong and 14 others, also reached the Siberian coast, but in a remote delta of the Lena River, far from any settlement. Melville eventually found the site. DeLong and all but 2 of his party had died of starvation and exposure. Of the Jeannette's original crew of 33 men, 20 died. The ship itself rested on the ocean floor north of the New Siberian Islands, and the farthest north record that the expedition had managed to set, 77 degrees north, was not even particularly impressive given the cost. What happened next is the detail that changes the entire story. In the summer of 1884, roughly 3 years after the Jeannette sank, a collection of objects washed ashore on the southwestern coast of Greenland, near the settlement of Julianhob. Among the items found were a pair of oilskin trousers with a list of crew members' names written inside, a pair of rubber boots, various pieces of equipment, and other artifacts that were later identified as belonging to the Jeannette. The wreckage had drifted from the New Siberian Islands, where the ship went down, all the way across the Arctic Ocean and down the eastern coast of Greenland, a journey of thousands of kilometers, accomplished in roughly 3 years by nothing more than the natural movement of the ice and the water beneath it. A Danish meteorologist named Henrik Mohn read about the discovery and wrote a short paper, suggesting that the drift implied a consistent current moving across the polar basin from the Siberian side toward Greenland. Nansen read that paper, and something clicked. If debris from a sunken ship could make that crossing in 3 years, driven by nothing but the ocean's own movement, then a ship that was built to survive the ice, a ship that could be locked in and carried rather than crushed, might be able to make the same journey deliberately. Not fighting the Arctic, not trying to break through it or outmaneuver it, but simply trusting the current, riding it, and emerging on the other side with the pole, or something very close to it, within reach. It was the kind of insight that looks obvious in retrospect and sounds impossible in the moment. And Nansen was not the only person who read Mond's paper. He was simply the one who decided to act on it. When Nansen began presenting his plan, the reaction from the established exploration community was not enthusiastic. That would be a considerable understatement. Adolphus Greely, one of the most experienced American Arctic explorers of the era, called the plan an illogical scheme of self-destruction. The Royal Geographical Society in London was sceptical. Other experts pointed out, reasonably enough, that no ship had ever survived sustained Arctic ice pressure, that the drift might not follow the path Nansen predicted, and that if anything went wrong, there would be no possibility of rescue. The criticism was not irrational. Every data point the exploration world had accumulated over 50 years of Arctic attempts pointed toward the same conclusion. The ice kills ships. Trapped ships become graves. Nansen's response to these objections was essentially that all of those ships had been built wrong and sailed wrong, and that if you designed a vessel specifically to rise under ice pressure rather than resist it, and if you chose your entry point based on the known drift pattern rather than guessing, the outcome would be different. He said this with the calm certainty of a man who had thought about almost nothing else for several years. Whether that certainty was wisdom or audacity was a question that would not be answered for 3 years. It is worth pausing here to consider who Nansen actually was at this point, because he was not simply a dreamer with a dangerous idea. He was 31 years old, already internationally recognised, and had a specific kind of credibility that came from having already done something that most people considered impossible. In 1888, 5 years before the Fram departed, Nansen had led a team of 6 men across the Greenland ice sheet on skis, travelling roughly 500 kilometres from the uninhabited east coast to the settled west coast, crossing terrain at altitudes above 2,000 metres in conditions that included whiteouts, crevasses, and temperatures that dropped well below freezing. No one had ever crossed Greenland before. Several people had tried and turned back. The conventional wisdom was that the interior ice sheet was impassable. Nansen crossed it anyway, and he did it by going from east to west, a direction that meant there was no going back once he started, because the east coast offered nothing to return to. That particular detail, the deliberate removal of the retreat option, would become something of a Nansen signature. He had a habit of committing so completely to a plan that failure became structurally more difficult than success. It was a psychological strategy as much as a logistical one, and it worked on the Greenland ice sheet in 1888. Whether it would work on the Arctic Ocean in 1893 was the next question. By the time he began recruiting for the Fram expedition, Nansen had the backing of the Norwegian government, a ship being designed to his specifications, and a plan that was either going to make him the most celebrated explorer in the world, or kill him and 12 other men in the most remote place on Earth. The history he was sailing into was not abstract. He knew the names of the ships and the years and the outcomes. He knew about Franklin and the Jeannette and the dozens of other expeditions that had gone north and not come back whole. He had read the accounts, studied the ice charts, and followed the logic of the Jeannette's wreckage across the map with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was proposing. And what he was proposing, when you strip away the scientific language and the careful planning, was to deliberately do the thing that had destroyed every ship before him, with the conviction that this time the ship would survive it. That conviction rested on one thing above all others, the ship itself. And the story of how that ship was built, what it was made of, and the particular genius of the man who designed it, is where this journey takes us next. There is something worth sitting with for a moment before we move forward, and it is this. The wreckage of the Jeannette did not arrive on the coast of Greenland as a disaster. It arrived as a message. 3 years of drifting, thousands of kilometres of ocean, and what the ice deposited on that shoreline was not only the remnants of a destroyed ship, but a piece of information that no expedition had ever been able to gather deliberately. The Arctic, in destroying the Jeannette, had accidentally revealed something about itself. It had shown that the polar basin was not a static, impenetrable wall of ice. It was moving, slowly, persistently, in a direction that could be traced and in theory predicted. And that distinction between a frozen obstacle and a frozen river was everything. To understand why this mattered so profoundly, it helps to consider what the scientific understanding of the Arctic actually looked like in the 1880s. The interior of the polar basin was almost entirely unknown. Expeditions had pushed north along the coasts, had mapped fragments of islands, had measured temperatures and noted ice conditions near the edges. But what lay in the deep centre, what the ocean floor looked like, how deep the water was, whether currents moved beneath the surface ice, whether the basin was a shallow shelf or a profound abyss, none of this was known with any confidence. The open polar sea theory, which had sent so many ships into disaster, was itself a product of this ignorance. In the absence of real data, people filled the gap with imagination, and the imagination of the era tended toward optimism about what lay beyond the last known horizon. Nansen was not immune to imagination, but he was trained as a scientist, and his particular gift was for following evidence where it led rather than where he hoped it would go. The evidence, in this case, led to a very specific place on the map. The Jeannette had been crushed near the New Siberian Islands, which sit off the northern coast of Siberia at roughly 75 degrees north latitude. The wreckage had appeared 3 years later on the southwestern coast of Greenland, thousands of kilometres away, after crossing the polar basin. Nansen traced that route on a chart and realised that the path implied a diagonal movement across the Arctic from the Siberian side toward the North Atlantic, passing north of, or possibly through, the region of the geographic pole. If that drift was consistent, and if it was driven by a genuine oceanic current rather than by chance, then a ship entering the ice near the New Siberian Islands at the right time of year would be carried more or less along the same route. It would not need to fight the ice, it would not need to break through it, it would simply need to survive being inside it. This sounds almost elegant when described in those terms, and that is part of what made it so difficult for the established exploration community to accept. Elegance in science is often a sign that someone has found a genuine pattern, but elegance in exploration proposals, particularly Arctic exploration proposals, had a long history of disguising wishful thinking. The people who criticised Nansen's plan were not foolish. They were applying the lessons of 50 years of evidence, and those lessons said that the Arctic ice was lethal, that ships caught in it were destroyed, and that no theoretical current was worth betting 13 lives on. Adolphus Greely, who had himself survived a catastrophic Arctic expedition in the early 1880s during which 18 of his 25 men died, called the plan an illogical scheme of self-destruction. He was not being melodramatic. He was being empirical, based on everything he knew. What Greely and the others could not fully account for was the quality of Nansen's reasoning, which was not simply optimistic but genuinely analytical. Nansen had identified the specific flaw in every previous Arctic disaster, and that flaw was not courage or preparation or route planning. It was the ship. Every vessel that had gone into the Arctic ice had been built to resist pressure from outside, with strong straight hulls designed to hold their shape against the sea. The problem was that ice does not press against a ship the way water does. Ice squeezes from the sides, concentrating enormous force along the hull, and a hull built to resist that pressure does not flex or deflect. It holds until it cannot hold any more, and then it fails catastrophically. The Jeannette had been reinforced before its voyage. It was considered one of the stronger ships of its era. The ice crushed it in a matter of days once the pressure built to a sufficient level. The same had happened to Franklin's ships, to dozens of others. The pattern was clear. The problem was that everyone kept trying to build a stronger wall against the ice, rather than asking whether the wall was the right response at all. Nansen asked the other question. What if the ship was shaped so that ice pressure did not crush it inward but instead pushed it upward? What if the hull were rounded at the bottom, like the underside of a bowl, so that when ice squeezed from the sides, the forces would slide beneath the ship and lift it rather than compress it. The ship would rise in the ice rather than be destroyed by it. It was a simple geometric insight with profound practical implications, and it required a designer capable of translating it into an actual vessel that could also function as a working ship for 5 years in the most extreme environment on Earth. The man Nansen found for this task was Colin Archer, a Scottish-Norwegian shipwright based in Larvik, on the western shore of the Oslofjord. Archer was 53 years old when he began working on the Fram design, and he was already well regarded for building sturdy, seaworthy vessels suited to the Norwegian coast. But nothing he had built before was remotely like what Nansen was asking for. The brief was essentially to design a ship that could do something no ship had ever done: survive years of Arctic pack ice from the inside, while also being capable of sailing across open ocean to reach the ice in the first place, and of carrying 13 men with enough supplies for 5 years. These were not entirely compatible requirements. A ship optimised for ice survival would be short, wide and heavy, with rounded sides and a shallow draft, which would make it slow, difficult to steer in open water, and prone to rolling in ocean swells. A ship optimised for ocean sailing would be long, narrow and deep, which would make it vulnerable to exactly the kind of ice pressure Nansen needed to defeat. Archer's achievement was in finding a design that compromised as little as possible on both. The Fram, as it was eventually built, was 39 metres long and 11 metres wide, giving it an unusually broad beam relative to its length. That width was essential for stability in the ice, and for providing the internal volume needed to store 5 years of provisions. The hull was designed with the rounded, egg-shaped cross-section that Nansen had theorised, curving inward at the waterline so that ice pressure would be directed upward rather than inward. But the shape alone was not enough. The hull itself had to be strong enough to withstand the initial force before the upward movement could take effect, and that meant building it with a thickness and density that went far beyond any ordinary ship. The walls of the Fram's hull were built up to 1¼ metres thick in places. That is not a typo or an exaggeration. In the sections most exposed to ice pressure, the outer skin of the ship was more than 1 metre of layered wood, built from multiple species chosen for complementary properties. The outer layer was sheathing of hard greenheart timber, a tropical hardwood so dense it barely floats and so resistant to abrasion that it was one of the few materials that could hold up against the grinding movement of pack ice. Behind that was a layer of oak, then another layer of oak, then internal planking, with the whole assembly braced by an internal frame of ribs and cross beams so dense that the inside of the hull looked less like the interior of a ship and more like the inside of a barrel. The structural members were not simply nailed or bolted, but fitted together so that the entire hull acted as a single unit under stress, distributing force across the whole structure rather than concentrating it at joints or fasteners. The internal bracing went further than the hull. Diagonal struts ran from the inner hull to the ship's central spine, and additional beams crossed the hold at intervals to prevent the sides from being pushed inward even if the outer layers began to deform. The deck was similarly reinforced because ice pressure does not only come from the sides. When a ship is lifted by ice, the forces can torque the hull in ways that would split an ordinary vessel along its length. The Fram was built to resist that torque as well, with a rigidity that Archer calculated could withstand pressures far exceeding anything a wooden ship had previously been expected to endure. The steam engine installed in the Fram was relatively modest, a 220 horsepower unit that could drive the ship at perhaps 6 or 7 knots in calm water. It was not designed for speed. It was designed to give the ship manoeuvrability when entering the ice and when navigating leads, the channels of open water that occasionally form between ice flows. The engine could be supplemented by sails, and the Fram was rigged as a 3-masted schooner, giving it reasonable sailing capability in open ocean. There was also a windmill mounted on deck, a detail that sounds almost whimsical until you consider what it was for. The windmill generated electricity to power the ship's lights, which meant that during the long Arctic winter, when the Fram would be locked in darkness for months, the crew would have electric lighting rather than relying on oil lamps. In 1893, electric lighting on a ship was not standard. It was a considered luxury, and Nansen included it because he understood that the psychological health of 13 men spending years in polar darkness was as important to the expedition's success as the structural integrity of the hull. That same attention to the human dimension showed up throughout the Fram's outfitting. The ship carried a library of 600 books, an extraordinary collection for a vessel of its size. There was a piano in the saloon. The galley was well equipped. The cabins were small but insulated, designed to retain heat in temperatures that would drop to 40 below zero outside. Nansen had thought carefully about what it would mean to spend years in confinement, and he had provisioned accordingly, not just with food and fuel, but with the materials of mental life. This was not standard practice for polar expeditions of the era, which tended to focus on physical survival and treat psychological well-being as a secondary concern if it was considered at all. The provisions themselves were calculated for 5 years, a number that reflected Nansen's honest assessment of how long the drift might take if everything went according to plan, and how long survival might need to be sustained if things did not. The food supply included tinned meats, dried fish, hardtack, preserved vegetables, lime juice to prevent scurvy, and a range of other staples chosen for caloric density and shelf life. Nansen had studied the dietary failures of previous expeditions carefully. Scurvy, which is caused by vitamin C deficiency and had devastated crews from Franklin's men onward, was a known and preventable condition by the 1890s, and the Fram's provisions were designed to prevent it. This was not a trivial detail. Scurvy had killed or incapacitated men on expeditions that were otherwise well planned, and it was the kind of slow, demoralizing deterioration that could destroy a crew's cohesion long before it became a physical emergency. The ship was launched in 1892 and underwent sea trials before the expedition departed. Nansen watched those trials with the particular intensity of a man whose entire theory rested on the assumption that this vessel could do what no ship had done before. The Fram handled well in open water, if somewhat sluggishly, which was expected given its proportions. The question of how it would behave in ice could not be answered until it was actually in ice. That answer would have to wait for the Arctic itself. To crew the Fram, Nansen recruited 12 men to join him, 13 in total including himself. The most important of these, in terms of the ship's day-to-day operation, was Otto Sverdrup, who served as captain. Sverdrup was a Norwegian sailor and explorer who had been part of Nansen's 1888 Greenland crossing, which meant he was one of the few people on Earth who had direct experience of travelling with Nansen in extreme conditions and had some sense of what the man's leadership actually looked like under pressure. The relationship between Nansen and Sverdrup was one of the quiet foundations of the expedition's success. Nansen was the scientist and the visionary, the one who had conceived the plan and would drive it forward. Sverdrup was the practical sailor, the one who would keep the ship functioning, and the crew organised through the long months when Nansen's attention was on his instruments and his calculations. The two men trusted each other, which in a small wooden ship in the Arctic surrounded by ice, in the dark, for years, was not a small thing. The rest of the crew included doctors, engineers, a meteorologist, and men with specific skills in navigation, mechanics, and seamanship. Nansen had selected them not only for their technical qualifications but for their temperaments. He was aware that the expedition's greatest internal threat was not any single catastrophic event, but the slow erosion of morale that comes from confinement, monotony, and the particular psychological weight of being very far from home with no certainty of return. He wanted men who could endure that without breaking, who could find purpose in the daily routine of scientific observation and ship maintenance even when nothing dramatic was happening. Finding that kind of person is harder than it sounds, and the fact that Nansen found 13 of them is part of why the expedition eventually succeeded. By the spring of 1893, the Fram was ready. The provisions were loaded, the crew was assembled, the scientific instruments were installed and calibrated. The 34 sled dogs that would be needed for the planned overland polar dash had been acquired. The ship sat in the harbour at Christiania, which is the city now called Oslo, and the departure date was set for late June. Norway watched with a mixture of pride and anxiety. The plan was known. The risks were understood. The question of whether Nansen's reasoning would prove correct, whether the ship would rise in the ice or be destroyed by it, whether the drift current was real and reliable, or a hopeful interpretation of one piece of evidence, that question was about to be answered by the Arctic itself, on its own terms, in its own time. And the moment the Fram's engines turned over and the lines were cast off from the dock, there would be no further opportunity for revision. What made the Fram genuinely unlike any ship that had come before it was not any single feature, but the totality of the thinking behind it. Every previous polar vessel had been built for a different kind of challenge. Ships like the Erebus and the Terror were naval vessels, reinforced and strengthened, but designed fundamentally around the assumption that they would move through ice, break it, push past it, and emerge on the other side into open water. The Arctic had answered that assumption with devastating consistency. Ice does not yield to ships that push against it. Ice gathers, accumulates, tightens, and eventually, given enough time and pressure, it wins. The hull of a conventional ship, no matter how reinforced, presents flat or gently curved surfaces to the ice, and the ice finds those surfaces and presses inward until something gives. What gave, on expedition after expedition, was the ship. Colin Archer understood this. Archer was a Scottish-Norwegian shipwright based in Larvik, on the western shore of the Oslofjord, and he had spent his career designing vessels for difficult northern waters. When Nansen came to him with the requirements for the Fram, Archer recognised immediately that the solution was not to make a stronger ship in the conventional sense, but to make a differently shaped one. The principle he applied was elegant in the way that good engineering solutions often are, which is to say it seems obvious in retrospect and was not obvious at all before someone thought of it. If ice pressing inward against a hull will always eventually crush it, then the answer is to design a hull that, when squeezed, is pushed upward rather than inward. A hull that does not resist the ice so much as redirect it. The result was the Fram's distinctive rounded, almost egg-shaped cross-section. Where a conventional ship's hull meets the waterline at relatively sharp angles, the Fram's hull curved smoothly and continuously from the keel upward, with no flat sections for ice to grip and compress. When pack ice closed around the Fram and began to tighten, the pressure would find no purchase on those curved surfaces. Instead of driving inward, it would slide beneath the hull and push the ship upward, lifting it out of the ice's grip rather than crushing it within. This was the theory. Whether it would work in practice was a question that could only be answered once the ship was actually in the ice, which was a somewhat uncomfortable position for everyone involved. The hull itself was built to a thickness that would have seemed excessive on any other vessel. The outer planking was of oak, a wood chosen for its density and resistance to impact. Behind the outer planking came a second layer, and behind that a third, with the innermost layer made partly of greenheart, a tropical hardwood so dense that it sinks in water and resists boring by marine organisms, which made it an unusual but effective choice for polar construction. In total, the hull walls reached a thickness of approximately 1¼ meters in the most critical sections. To put that in some perspective, the walls of a typical Victorian-era brick house were around 30 to 40 centimeters thick. The Fram's hull was more than 3 times that. It was less a ship's side and more a wooden fortress wall, curved and laminated and braced from within. The internal bracing was equally considered. Archer designed the Fram's interior skeleton as a continuous system of supports, beams and cross members that distributed the load of any external pressure throughout the entire structure, rather than allowing it to concentrate at any single point. The effect was something like the way a modern crash helmet is designed, not simply to be hard on the outside, but to spread and absorb impact energy across the whole. The Fram's ribs and frames were unusually close together, and the spaces between them were filled with additional material to prevent any section of the hull from flexing independently under load. The whole ship was meant to behave as a single unified structure rather than a collection of parts that might separate under stress. The dimensions of the vessel reflected Archer's priorities. The Fram was 39 metres long, which made it a relatively modest size for an ocean-going ship of the era, but it was 11 metres wide, giving it a beam-to-length ratio that was unusually broad. This breadth was deliberate. A wider hull is more stable in the ice, less likely to be tipped sideways, and better suited to the rounded cross-section that Archer's design required. It also meant the Fram was not a fast or elegant sailor in open water. Contemporary accounts describe it as rolling heavily in a swell, slow to respond, and not particularly comfortable to be aboard in rough seas. Nansen was aware of this, and accepted it as the necessary cost of a design optimised for a completely different environment. The Fram was not built to sail beautifully across the North Atlantic. It was built to survive the Arctic, and those are not the same brief. Propulsion was provided by both sail and steam. The Fram carried a triple expansion steam engine that could drive it at around 7 knots under power, which was adequate for manoeuvring in open water and for pushing through loose ice when necessary. The sails provided an additional option in favourable winds and reduced fuel consumption on the long passages to and from the Arctic. Fuel was a significant constraint on any polar expedition, since every kilogram of coal carried was a kilogram of something else not carried, and the balance between fuel, food, equipment, and scientific instruments required careful calculation. Nansen and Archer had worked through these numbers with considerable care, and the final loadout reflected many rounds of difficult prioritization. The ship's provisions were calculated for 5 years, as had been established during the planning phase. But what is worth dwelling on is the particular way that Nansen thought about those 5 years. He was not simply stocking a ship for a long voyage. He was designing a self-contained world that 13 men would inhabit, with no possibility of resupply, no port calls, no contact with the outside, and no way to address any deficiency once they were locked in the ice. Everything that the expedition might need, from spare engine parts to surgical instruments to the correct blend of foods to prevent nutritional deficiency, had to be anticipated in advance and loaded before departure. This was a logistical challenge of a kind that most people in 1892 had never faced and would never face. It required Nansen to think simultaneously as a scientist, a physician, an engineer, a psychologist, and a supply officer, which is a remarkable combination of roles for a man who had originally trained as a zoologist. The library of 600 books deserves particular attention here, not as an incidental detail, but as a reflection of Nansen's understanding of what the expedition would actually demand of its crew. 600 books is a substantial private library by any standard, and on a ship of the Fram's size, the space and weight they represented were not trivial. Nansen chose to include them anyway, because he recognised that the expedition's greatest sustained challenge would not be the dramatic moments, the ice pressure events, the storms, the equipment failures, but the long quiet stretches between those moments when 13 men had nothing to do but wait. Boredom in confined spaces is not merely unpleasant, it is psychologically corrosive. It produces irritability, depression, conflict, and a gradual erosion of the purposefulness that holds a team together. The books were, in this sense, as much a piece of survival equipment as the lime juice or the spare propeller shaft. The windmill that Nansen installed on the Fram to generate electricity for lighting was another example of this thinking applied practically. It was a small device by modern standards, capable of producing modest amounts of power, but in the context of an Arctic winter where darkness lasted for months and oil lamps produced heat, smoke, and a limited quality of light, electric lighting was a significant quality of life improvement. It also had a practical dimension beyond comfort. Men working in good light make fewer errors, maintain better records, and sustain the kind of careful scientific observation that was one of the expedition's primary purposes. The windmill was, in a quiet way, an investment in the quality of the science as much as in the well-being of the crew. The 34 sled dogs that were loaded aboard the Fram before departure represented a different kind of planning, one directed not at the drift itself but at the phase Nansen intended to follow it. The dogs were Siberian animals, acquired specifically for their cold weather endurance and their ability to work in harness, and they were intended to power the dog sled teams that Nansen planned to use for the overland dash toward the pole once the Fram had drifted far enough north. Managing 34 large working dogs on a ship for months before they were needed was not a small logistical burden. They required feeding, handling, veterinary attention, and a level of daily care that added to the crew's workload, but Nansen had judged them essential to the expedition's most ambitious objective, and they were aboard. The Fram was formally launched in October of 1892 at Archer's Yard in Larvik, an event that drew considerable attention and some continued scepticism from those who still doubted the entire enterprise. The sea trials that followed through the winter and into the spring of 1893 confirmed that the ship was structurally sound and handled as well as its unusual proportions allowed. What they could not confirm, and what no trial in temperate waters could ever confirm, was whether the hull design would perform as Archer intended when Arctic pack ice actually closed around it. That was the one variable that remained entirely theoretical until the moment of truth arrived. By the time the Fram was declared ready for departure in June of 1893, the ship had become something more than a vessel. It had become the physical embodiment of Nansen's entire argument, the proof that his theory deserved to be tested, the answer to every expert who had called the plan illogical or suicidal. If the ship worked, the skeptics were wrong. If it did not, the skeptics would never have the chance to say so, because there would be no one left to hear them. That was the particular quality of the wager Nansen had made. It was not the kind of bet where you could be wrong and walk away and try something different next time. It was the kind of bet where the outcome was total, in either direction. And so, when the Fram's engines finally turned and the lines came away from the dock at Christiania on the morning of June the 24th, 1893, the ship carried with it not only 13 men and their provisions and their dogs and their instruments and their 600 books, but also the weight of everything that had been thought and argued and built and decided over the previous years. It carried the memory of the Jeannette's wreckage washing ashore in Greenland. It carried the ghost of Franklin's men and the crushed hulls of every ship the Arctic had taken before. It carried Archer's calculations and Nansen's hypothesis and the quiet confidence of Otto Sverdrup at the helm. And it carried, somewhere beneath all of that, the simple, unanswered question that only the ice itself could resolve: whether a wooden ship, however brilliantly designed, could truly survive what the Arctic had done to every vessel that came before it. That question would not wait much longer for its answer. The morning of June the 24th, 1893, arrived in Christiania with the particular quality that important departures often seem to carry: a brightness that feels slightly too sharp, a stillness in the air that the crowd assembled at the dock manages to fill without quite dissolving. The city that would later be renamed Oslo was a place of considerable national feeling in that era, a country only decades removed from its long union with Denmark and still navigating its complicated political relationship with Sweden. Nansen was not merely a scientist to these people. He was already a national hero, the man who had crossed the Greenland ice sheet on skis in 1888 at the age of 26, a feat that had made him famous across Europe and had established, in the minds of his countrymen, the particular combination of intellectual courage and physical endurance that they had come to associate with his name. When the Fram's lines were cast off that morning, and the ship began to move away from the dock under the weight of 13 men, 34 dogs, 5 years of provisions, 600 books, a windmill, and a theory that most of the scientific establishment still regarded with deep suspicion, the crowd that had gathered to watch understood, in the way that crowds at important moments sometimes do, that they were watching something that might not come back. There were cheers, and there were flags, and there was the kind of noise that people make when they want to sound more certain than they feel. The route Nansen had planned for the Fram was not a direct charge northward. That was never the intention. The ship first headed north along the Norwegian coast, passing through the familiar waters of the Norwegian Sea, calling briefly at ports along the way to take on final supplies and allow crew members one last contact with the world they were leaving. From Norway, the plan was to sail east across the Barents Sea to Novaya Zemlya, the long double island that stretches northward between the Barents and Kara Seas, and then to continue east through the Kara Sea toward the New Siberian Islands. These were the same waters that the Jeannette had navigated before its destruction in 1881, and they were not gentle. The Kara Sea in particular had a reputation among sailors as one of the more treacherous stretches of Arctic water, prone to early freezing and difficult ice conditions, even in summer. Some called it the ice cellar of the Arctic. Nansen's plan was to push through it as quickly as the season allowed, reach the waters north of the New Siberian Islands where the Jeannette had been crushed, and find the entry point into the transpolar drift current that his theory predicted must exist there. The journey east was not without incident. The Kara Sea proved its reputation, offering enough ice to slow the Fram's progress and enough fog to make navigation difficult. But the ship's reinforced hull handled the early ice contact with a confidence that must have been quietly reassuring to the men watching from the deck. There is something particular about the first time a ship built to resist ice actually meets ice. A moment when engineering theory becomes physical fact, when the calculations on a drawing board translate into the sensation of a hull pressing through pack ice without yielding. The Fram moved through it. Not easily, not without effort, but without the sounds of distress that had preceded the destruction of lesser ships. This was not the moment of true testing. That would come later, when the ice was not something to push through, but something that closed around the ship from all sides with the full force of Arctic winter behind it. But as early evidence, it was encouraging. By early September of 1893, the Fram had reached the waters north of the Siberian coast near the New Siberian Islands, and Nansen began looking for the place. Not a marked location on a chart, because no such marking existed, but the place where the ice conditions and the current readings and the depth soundings and the accumulated judgment of a man who had spent years thinking about this moment all converged into a decision. He was looking for the right ice, the ice that would hold the ship without destroying it. The ice that sat in the current he believed would carry them northwest across the polar basin toward Greenland. The ice that would become, for however long the drift lasted, the Fram's home. On September the 22nd, 1893, at approximately 78 degrees and 50 minutes north latitude, Nansen gave the order to steer the Fram into the pack ice. The engines were kept running for a time as the ship pushed deeper into the floes, but the intention was clear and deliberate. They were not trying to find a way through, they were trying to find a way in. When the ice finally closed around the hull with enough density that forward motion became impossible, the engines were shut down. The propeller was lifted from the water to protect it. The rudder was secured, and the Fram, for the first time in its brief life, became stationary. Not anchored, not moored, not docked. Held. Held by ice in all directions, in water that no vessel had ever deliberately entered and stayed in, at a latitude where the sun would soon vanish for months. The sound of ice closing around a wooden ship is not easily described by people who have heard it, and the accounts left by the Fram's crew suggest that it was something that stayed with them. It begins as a low groaning, the kind of sound that seems to come from everywhere at once rather than from any particular direction, as if the ship itself has developed a voice. Then comes cracking, sharp and sudden, as ice under pressure fractures and shifts. Then the deeper sound, felt as much as heard, a sustained pressure against the hull that communicates itself through the deck planking and the frames and the ribs of the ship into the bodies of the men standing on it. Nansen wrote in his journal that the ship shuddered, that the ice spoke, that the moment had a quality of finality to it that no amount of preparation had quite made real until it actually happened. Several of the crew stood on deck and listened, some went below. Otto Sverdrup, who had sailed with Nansen in 1888, and whose quiet competence was one of the expedition's great assets, reportedly said very little. There was at that moment nothing particularly useful to say. The plan had been executed. The ship was in the ice. Whatever came next was no longer a matter of decision. It was a matter of endurance. What came next, in the immediate days that followed the ice entry, was the beginning of a scientific program that Nansen intended to pursue throughout the drift. He had not come to the Arctic simply to float. The expedition carried instruments for measuring water temperature at various depths, for taking depth soundings of the polar basin floor, for recording atmospheric pressure and air temperature, for tracking the ship's position through celestial navigation, and for measuring magnetic variations. These were not incidental activities. Nansen believed, correctly as it would turn out, that the Arctic Ocean was deeply unknown in a scientific sense, that the existing theories about its depth, its currents, its temperature structure, and its relationship to the global ocean system were based on almost no actual data. The drift was an opportunity, perhaps the only opportunity that would exist for some time, to collect that data continuously from a platform that was moving slowly through waters no ship had ever reached. The scientific observations began within days of the ice entry, and were maintained on a schedule that divided the crew into regular watches, ensuring that readings were taken at consistent intervals regardless of weather or darkness. This was the expedition's quieter purpose, less dramatic than the polar dash that Nansen was already planning, but in some ways more durable in its consequences. The first weeks in the ice were a period of adjustment for the 13 men aboard. The Fram's crew was not a collection of hardened polar veterans, though several had relevant experience. They were a mix of sailors, scientists, a doctor, a cook, and a few men who had signed on partly out of loyalty to Nansen and partly out of the particular kind of adventurousness that leads a person to agree to spend 3 years frozen in the Arctic. The ship's doctor, Henrik Blessing, was responsible for monitoring the crew's health and had brought medical supplies calculated for the full duration of the drift. The cook, Adolf Uel, whose role was arguably as important to crew morale as any other single factor, had provisions that included enough variety to prevent the monotony of diet from becoming its own form of psychological erosion. Nansen had been specific about the food. He'd studied the nutritional failures of previous expeditions and had loaded the Fram accordingly, with attention to fat content, caloric density, and the preservation of foods that would remain palatable after months in storage. This was not luxury. It was strategy. As October arrived, and the sun began its long retreat below the horizon, the men settled into the rhythms that would define their lives for the coming months. The scientific observations continued on their 4-hour schedule. The dogs, still living on deck in the cold that they were bred for, required daily feeding and attention. The ship's newspaper, called Framsja, which translates roughly as the Fram Lookout, was established as a way of maintaining a shared internal culture aboard the ship. Crew members contributed articles, jokes, observations, and commentary. It was a small thing, a handwritten publication circulated among 13 people in a wooden ship, but it served the same function that the book served and that the electric lighting served. It was a defence against the particular kind of emptiness that the Arctic winter could produce in the human mind. The windmill, when the wind cooperated, powered the electric lights that allowed the men to read and work in the evenings without the oppressive quality of oil lamp darkness. When the wind failed, the lamps came out, and the ship became a different kind of place, smaller and more shadowed, more aware of the ice pressing against its sides. The ice pressure events, when they came, were the moments that tested Archer's design most directly. Arctic pack ice is not static. It moves under the influence of wind and current, and when two large sections of ice press against each other, the forces involved are extraordinary. Ships that have been caught in pack ice under heavy pressure have been lifted, tilted, and in some cases crushed inward until the hull failed and the ship sank. The Jeannette had been destroyed in exactly this way. The The Fram's rounded hull was designed to respond to such pressure by rising, by being squeezed upward out of the ice rather than inward toward collapse. In the weeks and months after the ice entry, there were several events when the pressure built significantly, and the crew could hear and feel the ice working against the ship. The hull groaned, the frames creaked, the ship moved, not horizontally but vertically, rising slightly as Archer had predicted. And then the pressure would ease, and the Fram would settle back intact, undamaged, exactly as it was supposed to. Each time this happened, the relief among the crew was real and palpable, and each time it happened, Nansen's confidence in Archer's design grew slightly more solid. The ship was doing what it had been built to do. By the end of 1893, the Fram had drifted northwest from its entry point, carried by the current that Nansen had predicted, and the scientific data being collected was already beginning to suggest that the Arctic Ocean was not the shallow, mysterious body that many had imagined. The depth soundings were showing water far deeper than expected. The temperature readings at various depths were revealing a layered structure in the water column that had not previously been documented. The drift itself was confirming the existence of the transpolar current. All of this was exactly what Nansen had hoped to find, but the drift was also revealing something less encouraging. The rate of movement was slower than his most optimistic calculations had assumed, and the trajectory was not carrying the Fram as far north as it needed to go. The ship was drifting, yes. It was moving in roughly the right direction. But the numbers, when Nansen worked through them carefully, suggested that at the current rate the Fram would exit the ice well south of the North Pole, and well south of the farthest north record that he had set his sights on surpassing. This was not a crisis. Not yet. There was time still, months of drift ahead, and the trajectory could shift. But it was the beginning of a calculation that Nansen would carry with him through the long Arctic winter, turning it over in his mind in the way that a person turns over a problem that has no comfortable resolution, looking for the angle that changes the answer. And so the Fram drifted on through the darkness, a small wooden ship carrying 13 men and their instruments and their books and their dogs and their newspaper and their electric lights and their carefully preserved provisions, moving slowly across the top of the world at a pace that made progress almost invisible from day to day, but was real and measurable across the weeks. The ice held the ship held its shape, the men held themselves together. And somewhere beneath the hull, in water no instrument had ever reached, the Arctic Ocean kept its temperature readings and its depth soundings and its current patterns, offering up its secrets one careful observation at a time to the men who had come so far and given up so much simply to ask it the right questions. What those questions would eventually cost and what the answers would require was still forming itself in the silence of the polar night, waiting for the moment when Nansen's arithmetic would force a decision that no amount of careful planning had made easy to contemplate. That calculation, the slow arithmetic of drift and distance and the gap between where the Fram was going and where Nansen needed it to go, was the kind of problem that does not announce itself loudly. It settles in quietly, the way cold settles into a room when a door has been left open somewhere. You notice it gradually, and then all at once, and by the time you feel it fully it has already been present for a while. But that reckoning still lay ahead. For now, in the deepest months of the Arctic winter, the more immediate reality was simply this: 13 men in a wooden ship, locked in ice, in total darkness, at temperatures that would kill an unprotected person within minutes, trying to live as normally as possible in the most abnormal place on Earth. The darkness deserves particular attention, because it is easy to read the words 24-hour darkness and feel only a vague sense of the thing rather than its actual weight. From roughly October through February the sun did not rise. Not at a low angle, not briefly, not at all. The sky above the Fram was either black and scattered with stars or grey and featureless with cloud, and the line between night and day ceased to have any meaning. Clocks still marked the hours, meals still followed their schedule, the scientific observations still ran their 4-hour rotations, but the body's deepest orientation, the one that ties human alertness and rest to the movement of light across the sky, had nothing to anchor itself to. Experienced polar travellers speak of this not as dramatic suffering, but as a kind of slow, persistent pressure on the spirit, a flatness, a difficulty in feeling that time is moving at all. Days can begin to feel interchangeable in a way that is hard to describe unless you have lived inside it. Nansen was aware of this danger from the beginning. He had studied previous expeditions and understood that psychological deterioration, not just physical hardship, had undone crews before. Men who were well fed and warm could still become withdrawn, irritable, and eventually dangerous to themselves and the mission, if boredom and confinement were allowed to work on them unchecked. He had designed the expedition's daily structure with this in mind, not simply as a schedule but as a kind of architecture of purpose, something to give each hour a reason and each man a role. The scientific observations were the backbone of that structure. Every 4 hours, regardless of weather, regardless of how the ice was behaving, regardless of what hour the clock showed in the perpetual dark, a crew member took readings. Temperature of the air, temperature of the water at various depths, barometric pressure, wind speed and direction, magnetic compass readings, depth soundings, lowering a weighted line through a hole cut in the ice to measure how far down the ocean floor lay. These readings were not merely the mission's scientific output. They were also the mission's daily discipline, the thing that reminded every man on board that they were not simply waiting out a sentence, but actively doing something that no one had ever done before. The data accumulating in Nansen's notebooks was real, and it was new, and it was theirs, and that sense of active purpose was worth more than any amount of extra provisions. Cooking rotations were another anchor. Meals on the Fram were taken seriously. This was not incidental. Nansen had provisioned the ship with food that was genuinely good, not merely adequate. There was Norwegian flatbread, dried meats, butter, tinned vegetables, chocolate, and coffee. The cook for each rotation took the responsibility seriously, partly because good food was one of the expedition's genuine pleasures, and partly because in a small community of 13 people, a bad meal is a small but real injury to morale. The smell of cooking filling the below-deck space, the warmth of the stove, the gathering of men around a table in the lamplight, these were the ordinary human rituals that the expedition had transplanted into an entirely inhuman environment, and they mattered more for that transplantation, not less. The Framsja, the ship's handwritten newspaper, had by now become a genuine institution aboard the vessel. Crew members contributed to it with varying degrees of enthusiasm, but the mere act of having an internal publication, something that could be passed from hand to hand and argued over and laughed at, created a shared cultural life that the ship would otherwise have lacked. There were articles about the expedition's progress. There were observations about the behaviour of the ice. There were jokes, some of them apparently quite poor, which in a small community is its own form of bonding. There were personal reflections, careful enough not to alarm anyone but honest enough to be worth reading. It was, in miniature, what a good local newspaper does in any small community. It creates a record of shared experience and, in doing so, reinforces the idea that the community is real and its life is worth documenting. The library of 600 books was another resource that Nansen had not included by accident. The men read extensively through the winter months. Novels, scientific texts, histories, poetry. The ship carried works in Norwegian, German, and English. Some men worked through the library systematically. Others returned to favourites. A few used the long, dark hours to study subjects they had never had time for at home. One crew member, by several accounts, taught himself celestial navigation theory in greater depth during the drift than he had ever managed to learn it in formal training. The books were not entertainment in the passive modern sense. They were a way of keeping the mind active and engaged, of maintaining the habit of thought in an environment that could otherwise reduce a person to simple endurance. The 34 sled dogs living on deck were a constant presence in the expedition's daily life, and they added a layer of noise, smell, and animal energy to the ship that was, in its own way, important. Dogs require attention. They need to be fed, checked for injury, managed in their social hierarchies, and occasionally separated when tensions ran high among them. Caring for the dogs gave certain crew members a daily physical task that took them outside the enclosed space of the ship and into the cold air, and that small regular exposure to the world beyond the hull was not nothing. The dogs were also a reminder of the expedition's larger ambition. They were not pets. They had been brought for a specific purpose, trained for sledding, selected for endurance, and their presence on deck was a standing physical symbol of the plan that Nansen was still developing in his calculations below. The electric lighting, powered by the windmill mounted on the ship's deck, was a luxury that no previous polar expedition had enjoyed, and its psychological value was difficult to overstate. Oil lamps and candles produce a warm but limited light, and they consume oxygen and produce a faint but real quality of stuffiness in an enclosed space. Electric lights, by contrast, could illuminate the below-decks area with something approaching the quality of an indoor room on a winter evening at home. When the wind blew steadily enough to run the windmill, the Fram's interior was bright and functional. Men could read easily, work on instruments, write in journals, and move around without the slightly oppressive quality that comes from living by lamplight in a small space. When the wind failed and the windmill stopped, the lamps came out, and the ship's interior contracted slightly in feeling if not in dimension. The difference between the two states was noticed by the crew and written about in journals. It was a small thing, the difference between one kind of artificial light and another, but small things accumulate over months of darkness, and the windmill was one of the expedition's quiet engineering triumphs. The ice pressure events continued through the winter, appearing without predictable schedule, building sometimes over hours and sometimes very suddenly. When the pack ice around the ship began to move, the sounds it produced were unlike anything most of the crew had encountered. Arctic sea ice under pressure does not simply creak. It produces a range of sounds that those who have heard them describe with unusual precision in their journals, perhaps because the sounds were so strange that the mind insisted on recording them carefully. There was a deep groaning, low and structural, that seemed to come from everywhere at once. There was a sharper cracking, like wood splitting, that could be startlingly loud. There was sometimes a grinding sound as ice surfaces moved against each other, and beneath all of it, a kind of low vibration that could be felt through the hull, and through the deck and through the soles of a person's feet as much as heard with the ears. When these events occurred, the crew gathered and watched, and the thing they were watching for was the behaviour of the hull. In a ship with a conventional flat-bottomed or V-shaped hull, ice pressure of sufficient force would begin to push the sides inward. The frames would flex, then crack, then the hull planking would fail, and the ship would take on water. The Jeannette had died this way. Franklin's Erebus and Terror had died this way. The ice did not care about the reputation of the ships it crushed. But the Fram's rounded hull, Colin Archer's egg-shaped design, responded to lateral pressure by translating it into vertical force. The ice squeezed, and the ship rose. Not dramatically, not theatrically, but measurably, perceptibly, the Fram would lift slightly in the ice under heavy pressure, as though the ocean itself were gently pushing it upward. The hull groaned, but did not buckle. The frames flexed, but did not crack. The planking held. And when the pressure eased, the ship settled back, and the men looked at each other in the particular way that people look at each other when something they were told would work has actually worked. By the middle of the first winter, the crew had developed a relationship with the ice pressure events that was no longer simple fear. They remained alert to them, because the consequences of a hull failure in their situation were not survivable in any meaningful sense. But they had also accumulated enough experience of watching the Fram rise and hold and settle that their confidence in the ship had grown into something more than theoretical trust. They had seen the design work. They had heard the sounds that should have preceded disaster and watched disaster fail to arrive. The Fram had proved itself not once but repeatedly, and that proof had a settling effect on the men inside it. Nansen himself moved through the winter months in a state that his journals describe as productive but restless. He was not a man who found confinement easy, and the drift, for all its scientific richness, was also an exercise in enforced patience that sat uneasily with his temperament. He conducted his observations with precision. He managed the crew with care. He wrote extensively. But the calculations about the drift trajectory were always present in his thinking, and as the winter deepened and the weeks accumulated, those calculations were becoming harder to read optimistically. The current was carrying the Fram in the right general direction, but the rate and the angle were not aligning with what he needed. The pole was not coming closer fast enough. The record was not within reach of the ship's drift alone. He did not share the full weight of this with the crew immediately. There was nothing to be done about it in the middle of winter darkness, and a leader who introduces an unsolvable problem before its time has come serves no one. But he was working through the alternatives quietly, methodically, with the same care he had applied to the expedition's design. If the ship could not carry him close enough to the pole, then perhaps the ship was not the final instrument. Perhaps the final instrument was already living on the deck above his head, 34 dogs waiting in the cold, bred for exactly the kind of travel that the ice between the Fram and the pole would require. That idea, still forming, still being tested against the arithmetic, would not resolve itself until the following year. But it was already there in the winter of 1893 and 1894, growing quietly in the background of the expedition's daily life, the way the most consequential decisions often grow, not in a single dramatic moment, but in the slow accumulation of evidence that eventually makes one course of action feel not merely possible, but necessary. The darkness would lift in February. The sun would return, low and pale at first, then climbing. The dogs would still be there. The ice would still be moving. And the numbers, when Nansen ran them again in the returning light, would give him the answer he'd been approaching all winter. The answer that would change the nature of the expedition entirely and send 2 men out alone onto the ice toward the farthest point any human being had ever reached. The light returned in February of 1895 the way it always does in the high Arctic, tentatively, almost apologetically, as though it were not entirely sure it was welcome. It appeared first as a thin brightening along the southern horizon, a pale smear of colour that was neither day nor night but something in between, lasting only minutes before the darkness reasserted itself. Then the minutes stretched. Then the sun itself appeared, low and orange and almost horizontal, skimming the surface of the ice without quite warming it, casting long blue shadows across the snow. The crew came up on deck to watch it, as they always did after months of darkness, standing in the cold with their faces turned toward it like something between gratitude and disbelief. The sun, which most people in the world took entirely for granted, had become to these 13 men a meaningful event. Nansen watched it too. But what he was calculating as the light returned and the measurements became easier, and the drift track could be assessed with fresh precision, was not the beauty of the sunrise. He was running the numbers again, the same numbers he had been working through quietly all winter, and the numbers were giving him the same answer they had given him before. Only now the answer was clearer and the remaining options were fewer. The Fram's drift was real. The transpolar current existed exactly as he had theorized. The ship was moving, carried by the slow rotation of ice across the polar basin, and the direction was broadly correct. But broadly correct was not the same as sufficient. When Nansen plotted the drift rate against the remaining distance and projected the trajectory forward, the mathematics produced a result that was difficult to argue with. At the current pace and angle, the Fram would exit the polar basin south of the existing farthest north record. It would complete the drift, it would survive, it would return, and it would have achieved something genuinely significant in terms of scientific data. But it would not reach the pole. It would not even come close to the pole. The record would remain where it was, and the specific geographic ambition that had been part of the expedition's purpose from the beginning would go unmet. This was not a crisis exactly. The scientific mission was intact. The ship was sound. The crew was healthy. But Nansen was not a man who had crossed Greenland on skis and designed a revolutionary polar vessel, and spent years convincing skeptics of his theory only to watch the final piece of the plan slip quietly out of reach without attempting something about it. He was constitutionally incapable of that kind of resignation, and as it happened, he had already been thinking about the alternative for months. The alternative was to leave the ship. It sounds simple when stated that way, and the simplicity is almost misleading, because the implications of those 4 words in this particular context were enormous. The Fram was not anchored somewhere it could be returned to. The Fram was drifting slowly but continuously, carried by the same current that Nansen had staked his reputation on. If he left the ship and set out north across the ice on foot and by sled, the ship would not wait for him. It would continue moving. When he turned around and tried to return, there would be nothing to return to. The ship he left would be in a different position than the ship he needed to reach, and the difference would grow with every day he spent away. This was not a theoretical concern. It was a practical and potentially fatal one. The plan, therefore, could not be to leave and come back. The plan had to be to leave and not come back to the ship at all. He and whoever accompanied him would ski north toward the pole, push as far as they could, and then turn south toward land. Specifically toward Franz Josef Land, the Norwegian discovered archipelago that lay roughly to the southwest, which had been partially charted, and which offered at least the theoretical possibility of encountering other human beings or a supply depot or some means of eventual rescue. Franz Josef Land was not a safe haven. It was a remote, largely uninhabited collection of islands in the high Arctic. But it was land, and it was in the right direction for the return journey, and for Nansen that was enough to constitute a plan. The man he chose to take with him was Hjalmar Johansen. This choice deserves a moment's attention, because it tells you something about how Nansen thought. Johansen was not the most senior member of the crew. He had joined the expedition as a stoker, responsible for maintaining the steam engine, and had worked his way into Nansen's confidence through a combination of physical capability, calm temperament, and demonstrated competence in cold weather conditions. He was an accomplished gymnast, deeply fit, and possessed of the kind of quiet endurance that extreme conditions either reveal or destroy in a person. Nansen had watched him through the winter and had made his assessment. Johansen was the man he wanted beside him on the ice, not because of his rank, but because of what he was made of. The preparation took weeks. Every item had to be considered with the knowledge that there would be no resupply, no backup, no second chance if something was forgotten or failed. They would take 28 dogs, selected from the 34 that had survived the drift so far. They would take 2 kayaks, disassembled and loaded onto the sleds, because the route south would almost certainly require crossing open leads of water, and without the kayaks those crossings would be impossible. They would carry 3 months of food calculated with the grim arithmetic of polar survival, which meant that if the journey took longer than 3 months, the food calculation would stop mattering because other things would have gone wrong first. They would carry a small stove, fuel, sleeping bags made of reindeer skin, specialized clothing, navigation instruments, and the tools necessary to repair equipment in the field. Nansen also made a decision that reflected both his confidence and his honesty about the situation. He left detailed instructions for Otto Sverdrup, who would take full command of the Fram in his absence. Those instructions covered every scenario Sverdrup might face, including the scenario in which Nansen and Johansen did not return. The ship was to continue the drift, exit the polar basin when the ice released it, and return to Norway. The scientific data was to be preserved and published regardless of what happened to the 2 men on the ice. The expedition's knowledge was not to be held hostage to the fate of any individual, including Nansen himself. This was not a dramatic gesture. It was the practical decision of a man who understood that the information they had gathered was larger than any single life, including his own. February 26th, 1895. The date carries a particular weight in the history of polar exploration. though it passed on the ice without ceremony. The temperature was somewhere around -40°C. The sky was clear. The sun was present but low, and offering light without warmth, the particular cruelty of the Arctic spring. Nansen and Johansen loaded the sleds, harnessed the dogs, and said their farewells to the crew of the Fram. There is no record of long speeches. The journals suggest it was brief and practical, the kind of goodbye that people exchange when everyone present understands that extended sentiment is not useful and might make things harder. Sverdrup shook Nansen's hand. The dogs were restless and ready. And then the two men turned north, and the Fram grew smaller behind them, and then it was gone. The ice between the Fram and the pole was not the smooth surface that the phrase "frozen ocean" sometimes suggests to people who have not encountered it. It was, in places, actively hostile terrain. The Arctic pack ice is not a single continuous sheet. It is a collection of ice floes of varying sizes, constantly moving relative to each other, constantly grinding and colliding and fracturing and refreezing. Where two floes meet and compress, they produce pressure ridges, which are essentially walls of broken ice thrown upward by the collision, sometimes reaching heights of several meters, jagged and unstable and deeply inconvenient to anyone trying to move across them with laden sleds and 28 dogs. Moving through pressure ridges meant lifting the sleds over obstacles, cutting through ice with axes, finding routes around formations that blocked direct progress, and doing all of this in temperatures that made every physical task harder than it would otherwise be, and that punished any pause in movement with a cold that settled into the body quickly and completely. There were also open leads to contend with. A lead is a channel of open water that forms when two sections of ice drift apart. They can appear without warning, cutting across what had been a continuous surface, and they can be anywhere from a few meters to several kilometers wide. In February and early March, the leads were often refreezing, covered with a thin layer of new ice that might or might not support the weight of a sled and a team of dogs. Nansen and Johansen developed the skill of reading this new ice quickly, tapping it, watching how it flexed, making the judgment about whether to cross or to follow the lead until it narrowed. Getting that judgment wrong would mean losing dogs, sleds, equipment, and possibly their lives to water that was cold enough to incapacitate a person in minutes. Despite all of this, they moved north. The dogs were strong and the conditions, while brutal, were workable. The daily routine was exhausting in the specific way of extreme physical effort sustained over time, where the body adapts and performs, but the reserves that the adaptation draws on are finite and do not fully replenish overnight. They navigated by the sun and by their instruments, checking their latitude regularly, watching the numbers change as the pole drew closer. The numbers changed slowly. The Arctic is very large, and the distance between where they had started and where they were going was not a distance that diminished quickly. April 7th, 1895. Nansen took his observation and read the result and confirmed it, and read it again. The latitude was 86 degrees, 13.6 minutes north. No human being in the history of the species had ever stood at a latitude higher than this. The previous record, set by the crew of the USS Jeannette, and then improved incrementally by various expeditions over the following years, had stood at 83 degrees 24 minutes north. Nansen and Johansen had pushed the farthest north record by nearly 3 full degrees, which in polar terms represents an enormous distance. They were closer to the North Pole than anyone had ever been. They were also still approximately 400 kilometers away from it, and they had to stop. There was no ceremony. Nansen's journal entry for April 7th, 1895 is characteristically precise and characteristically restrained. He records the latitude, he notes the weather conditions, he describes the decision to turn back. What he does not do is spend many words on the emotional weight of the moment, which is perhaps itself revealing. The farthest north was not, in that moment, primarily an achievement to be savoured. It was a point of maximum exposure beyond which the mathematics of survival became unfavourable. Every kilometre they pushed further north was a kilometre they would have to cover again on the way south, with fewer dogs, less food, and the same hostile terrain. The pole was 400 kilometres away. They had 3 months of food. The calculation was not difficult. They turned south. The return journey was, in almost every measurable way, harder than the journey north. The dogs were already tiring, their numbers beginning to decline as the weakest animals gave out and were used to feed the remaining ones, which is the particular grimness of polar dog sledding that the expedition accounts record with matter-of-fact clarity, because there was nothing else to do about it. The pressure ridges did not become easier. The lids became more frequent as the Arctic spring advanced, and the ice began its seasonal loosening. Navigation became more demanding as they moved away from the simple goal of increasing latitude toward the more complex task of finding a specific archipelago in a specific direction across a surface that offered no landmarks and changed constantly. They also encountered in the open water crossings a problem that was not on any list of anticipated dangers. A walrus surfaced beneath one of the kayaks during a crossing and attacked it, driving its tusks through the hull and nearly capsizing the boat. Nansen, who was in the water at the time, managed to reach the kayak and hold it and drive the animal away. The kayak was repaired with the materials they had brought for exactly such contingencies, but the encounter is a useful reminder that the dangers of the return journey were not only the ones that could be planned for. The Arctic had its own ideas about what obstacles to present and when. Through all of this, Johansen performed exactly as Nansen had assessed he would. He was steady, capable, and uncomplaining in conditions that would have broken many people. The two men developed the particular wordless efficiency of a working partnership under extreme stress, where communication reduces to what is necessary and trust becomes the operating assumption, because there is no time and no energy for anything else. They were, by any reasonable measure, keeping each other alive. By August of 1895, they had been travelling for nearly 6 months. The food was critically low. The dogs were almost all gone. They were exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness into something more fundamental, the kind of depletion that comes from sustained effort without rest in conditions that do not permit recovery. And ahead of them, visible at last through the summer haze, was land. Franz Josef land. Not safe, not warm, not inhabited, but land. Solid ground. A surface that did not move beneath their feet. A place where they might, if they were careful and fortunate, survive the winter. What happened next, on those uninhabited islands through the long Arctic winter, would test both men in ways that the journey north had not. Because moving is one thing, stopping is another, and the particular difficulty of two people alone in total darkness and silence, with no contact with the outside world, and no certainty that anyone was looking for them, or that anyone even knew they were alive, is a different kind of challenge from the challenge of crossing broken ice. It is quieter, slower, and in some ways more demanding, because it asks not for physical effort but for the harder thing, the willingness to simply endure day after day in a hut barely large enough to lie down in, at the edge of the world, waiting for a spring that would eventually come, because springs always do, even at the edge of the world, even when they feel impossibly far away. But let us go back, just slightly, to the journey that brought them to that coastline. Let us go back to the ice, to the open water, to the particular texture of what those weeks and months actually felt like from inside them. Because the numbers and the coordinates tell only part of the story. The rest lives in the details, in the small physical facts of what it means to travel across the top of the world with a dwindling team of dogs and 2 kayaks, and a horizon that refuses to offer anything recognisable. When Nansen and Johansen had left the Fram on February 26, 1895, they had departed into temperatures that sat at around minus 40 degrees Celsius and showed no particular interest in rising. To put that number into some kind of human context, it is the temperature at which Celsius and Fahrenheit happen to converge, the one point on the scale where both systems agree, as if the universe itself decided that this particular level of cold deserved its own landmark. At -40, exposed skin freezes in minutes. Metal conducts the cold directly into bare flesh. Breath clouds immediately and ice crystals form in the hair and on the eyebrows and in the fur around the face. Every inhaled breath carries a faint burning sensation deep in the lungs. It is not a temperature that allows for carelessness, and Nansen and Johansen were not careless men. They had started with 28 dogs arranged in 2 teams, each man driving his own sled. The sleds were loaded with equipment and provisions calculated to last approximately 3 months, which was the window Nansen had determined was the outer limit of what they could carry and what the journey would permit. The kayaks were strapped to the sleds, because the kayaks were not optional weight. They were the only means by which the 2 men could cross the open leads of water that the Arctic Spring would eventually open between the ice flows, and without the ability to cross those leads, there was no return journey. The kayaks were, in that sense, not equipment. They were the conditional possibility of survival. The terrain they moved across was not the smooth white plain that the word ice sometimes suggests to people who have not seen it. Arctic pack ice is fractured, heaved and compressed into what are called pressure ridges, formations that occur when 2 sections of ice are forced against each other by the movement of currents and wind beneath and above the surface. These ridges can rise to several meters in height, with broken blocks of ice piled at angles and gaps between them that must be crossed on foot or bridged with the sleds. Progress across a pressure ridge is not measured in kilometers per hour. It is measured in the number of times a sled must be lifted, repositioned and dragged before the other side is reached. It is grinding, exhausting work, and it is the kind of work that depletes not just the body but the will, because the ridge you have just crossed is followed by another and then another, and the flat ice between them offers only a brief recovery before the next obstacle rises. Nansen had estimated before departure that they could cover perhaps 20 to 25 kilometers per day under reasonable conditions. The Arctic did not honour this estimate. On some days they managed 15 kilometers. On others, fighting through particularly broken terrain, they managed far less. The ice also drifted, which meant that the position they had worked all day to reach was not always the position they occupied by the following morning, because the floe they were sleeping on had moved while they slept, sometimes south, undoing a portion of what they had gained going north. This was the same drift current that the Fram relied upon, but experienced from inside it, from the surface of the ice rather than from the relative shelter of a ship. The drift felt less like a scientific observation and more like a personal frustration. And yet the numbers climbed. Slowly, stubbornly, the latitude increased. Each day Nansen took his observation and recorded the result, and over the weeks the figures moved northward in small increments that accumulated into something significant. They passed 84 degrees north, then 85. Then, in early April, the observations began to show numbers that had never appeared in any human record before. They were in territory that no person had ever physically occupied. The Arctic stretched around them in every direction, identical in appearance to the ice they had already crossed, but different in the absolute sense that no one had ever stood in it before. There were no footprints ahead of them. There were no flags, no cairns, no evidence of any previous human presence, just ice and sky, and the 2 of them moving through it. April 7th, 1895. Nansen took his observation and read the result and confirmed it, and read it again. The latitude was 86 degrees, 13.6 minutes north. No human being in the history of the species had ever stood at a latitude higher than this. The previous record, set by the crew of the USS Jeannette, and then improved incrementally by various expeditions over the following years, had stood at 83 degrees 24 minutes north. Nansen and Johansen had pushed the farthest north record by nearly 3 full degrees, which in polar terms represents an enormous distance. They were closer to the North Pole than anyone had ever been. They were also still approximately 400 kilometers away from it, and they had to stop. there was no ceremony. Nansen's journal entry for April 7th, 1895 is characteristically precise and characteristically restrained. He records the latitude, he notes the weather conditions, he describes the decision to turn back. What he does not do is spend many words on the emotional weight of the moment, which is perhaps itself revealing. The farthest north was not, in that moment, primarily an achievement to be savoured. It was a point of maximum exposure beyond which the mathematics of survival became unfavourable. Every kilometre they pushed further north was a kilometre they would have to cover again on the way south, with fewer dogs, less food, and the same hostile terrain. The pole was 400 kilometres away. They had 3 months of food. The calculation was not difficult. They turned south. The return journey was, in almost every measurable way, harder than the journey north. The dogs were already tiring, their numbers beginning to decline as the weakest animals gave out and were used to feed the remaining ones, which is the particular grimness of polar dog sledding that the expedition accounts record with matter-of-fact clarity because there was nothing else to do about it. The pressure ridges did not become easier. The leads became more frequent as the Arctic spring advanced and the ice began its seasonal loosening. Navigation became more demanding as they moved away from the simple goal of increasing latitude toward the more complex task of finding a specific archipelago in a specific direction across a surface that offered no landmarks and changed constantly. What made this navigation challenge so formidable is worth pausing on, because it is easy to underestimate. Nansen and Johansen were navigating by dead reckoning, which means they were calculating their position based on their known starting point, their estimated speed, their compass bearing, and the time elapsed. Dead reckoning is a legitimate and historically proven technique, but it accumulates error. Every small inaccuracy in speed estimation, every slight compass deviation, every unmeasured effect of the ice drift compounds over time into a positional uncertainty that grows with each passing day. After weeks of travel, the uncertainty around their calculated position was significant. Franz Josef Land was not a single point on a map, but an archipelago of islands spread across a considerable area. Finding it required not pinpoint precision but a broad enough approach to intersect with it somewhere along its extent. Nansen understood this, and his navigation was designed accordingly, but the margin for error was not comfortable, and both men knew it. They also encountered, in the open water crossings, a problem that was not on any list of anticipated dangers. A walrus surfaced beneath one of the kayaks during a crossing and attacked it, driving its tusks through the hull and nearly capsizing the boat. Nansen, who was paddling at the time, managed to reach the damaged kayak and stabilize it and drive the animal away. The walrus, from its own perspective, was presumably defending territory, or responding to something it perceived as a threat, but the effect from the human side was a kayak with holes in it, and 2 men in the middle of open Arctic water who needed those kayaks to be functional in order to survive. The repair was made with the patching materials they had brought specifically for such contingencies, because Nansen had thought carefully about what could go wrong and had prepared accordingly. But the encounter is a useful reminder that the dangers of the return journey were not only the ones that could be anticipated. The Arctic maintained its own catalogue of hazards and presented them according to its own schedule. Through all of this, Johansen performed with a steadiness that Nansen would later describe with genuine admiration. Hjalmar Johansen was 28 years old at the time of the departure from the Fram, younger than Nansen by several years, a trained gymnast and military officer who had joined the expedition as a stoker before demonstrating the qualities that led Nansen to choose him as his companion for the polar dash. He was not a scientist, he was not famous, he was not, in the public narrative of the expedition, the central figure. But in the practical reality of those months on the ice, he was indispensable. The 2 men developed the particular wordless efficiency of a working partnership under extreme stress, where communication reduces to what is necessary, and trust becomes the operating assumption, because there is no time and no energy for anything else. They were, by any reasonable measure, keeping each other alive, which is a form of partnership that tends to create a bond that ordinary circumstances rarely produce. By August of 1895, they had been travelling for nearly 6 months. The food was critically low. The dogs were almost all gone, the last of them having been sacrificed to the necessity of keeping the men fed when the other food sources ran out. They were exhausted in a way that went deeper than physical tiredness into something more fundamental, the kind of depletion that comes from sustained effort without rest in conditions that do not permit recovery. And ahead of them, visible at last through the summer haze, was land. Franz Josef Land. Not safe, not warm, not inhabited, but land, solid ground. A surface that didn't move beneath their feet. A place where they might, if they were careful and fortunate, survive the winter. But August in the Arctic is not a generous month in which to make plans. The light was already beginning to change, the long polar summer tilting toward its end, and both men understood that the window for travel was closing. They could not push further that year. They had reached land, but they could not reach civilization, because civilization was hundreds of kilometers away across open water that would soon be freezing again, and they had no ship, no radio, no way to communicate their position to anyone. They had their kayaks, their remaining supplies, and each other. And they had the knowledge, which was both reassuring and sobering, that if they built a shelter and managed their resources carefully, they could survive until spring. The Arctic had taught them, over the preceding months, that survival was possible in conditions that looked from the outside like certain death. What it required was patience, practicality, and the willingness to reduce the problem to its most immediate components: food, warmth, shelter, time. What happened next on those uninhabited islands through the long Arctic winter would test both men in ways that the journey north had not, because moving is one thing, and stopping is another entirely. The particular difficulty of two people alone in total darkness and silence, with no contact with the outside world and no certainty that anyone was looking for them, or that anyone even knew they were alive, is a different kind of challenge from the challenge of crossing broken ice. It is quieter, slower, and in some ways more demanding, because it asks not for physical effort but for the harder thing, the willingness to simply endure, day after day, in a space barely large enough to lie down in, at the edge of the world, waiting for a spring that would eventually come, because springs always do, even at the edge of the world, even when they feel impossibly far away. They built the hut in the way that people build things when they have almost nothing to work with and cannot afford to fail. The location they chose was on a small, unnamed island within the Franz Josef Land archipelago, a stretch of rock and ice in the high Arctic that sits at roughly 80 degrees north latitude, so far from anything that could be called civilization that the word itself begins to feel like a category error. The island offered one thing they needed above all others at that moment, which was solid ground with enough loose stone to construct walls, and so that is what they did. They gathered flat rocks and stacked them carefully, fitting them together without mortar, relying on weight and arrangement to hold the structure in place against the wind. The walls rose to roughly 1.5 meters in height. The floor space measured approximately 2 meters by 3 meters, which is smaller than most bathroom closets in a modern home, and yet it was the space in which 2 men would spend the next 9 months of their lives. The roof they made from the walrus hides they had collected stretched and secured over the top of the stone walls, heavy enough to resist the wind, and just barely waterproof enough to keep the worst of the weather out. It was not insulated in any meaningful sense. It was not warm. But it was enclosed. An enclosure, at that latitude, in that season, is the difference between the possible and the impossible. The interior, once they had arranged themselves inside it, left almost no room for movement. 2 men lying side by side filled most of the available floor space. Their equipment, their remaining food stores, their tools and sleeping bags occupied what little remained. There was no standing room to speak of. To move from one end of the hut to the other required a kind of careful, deliberate rearrangement. The ceiling was low enough that sitting upright was the most they could manage. It was, in almost every physical sense, a box. A very cold, very dark, very small box at the top of the world, and it was the only home they had. For light and heat, they burned blubber. They had rendered the fat from the polar bears and walruses they hunted, collecting it carefully and storing it in containers made from whatever was available. A blubber lamp is a simple thing, a shallow vessel of fat with a wick of some kind, moss or twisted cloth that draws the oil up and burns it. It produces a small, dim, smoky flame that does not so much illuminate a space as suggest that illumination is theoretically possible. It generates a modest amount of heat, enough to raise the temperature inside the hut to something marginally above what it was outside, but not enough to make the word warm applicable in any conventional sense. The walls sweated with condensation. The sleeping bags, which were made from reindeer hide and had served them reasonably well during the journey, became damp and stayed damp. Everything smelled of blubber smoke and animal fat, and the particular staleness that comes from a small enclosed space occupied by two people with no access to washing facilities for an extended period of time. It was, in the language of modern comfort, profoundly unpleasant. In the language of survival, it was adequate, and adequate was enough. Their diet consisted almost entirely of polar bear and walrus meat, eaten raw or cooked over the blubber lamp when they had the patience and fuel to manage it. Polar bear liver, they had already learned, was something to avoid, because it contains concentrations of vitamin A high enough to cause serious illness, a fact that polar travellers discovered through painful experience rather than prior knowledge. But the muscle meat was edible and nutritious, and the fat provided the caloric density their bodies needed to maintain temperature in conditions that demanded an enormous amount of energy simply to stay alive. They ate a great deal. The body in extreme cold is a furnace that burns through fuel at a rate that is difficult to appreciate from a temperate climate. Keeping two men alive through an Arctic winter required not just shelter, but a continuous, reliable supply of meat, and obtaining that meat meant hunting, which meant going outside. Going outside in an Arctic winter is not a casual undertaking. The temperature dropped to levels that made the cold of their polar dash seem, in retrospect, almost moderate. -30, -40 degrees Celsius, with wind that drove the effective temperature lower still. The darkness was total from October onward, the polar night settling in with a completeness that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. Not the darkness of a room with the curtains drawn, not the darkness of a cloudy night, but a darkness that is simply the absence of the sun for months at a time, uninterrupted, absolute. They navigated by memory and by the faint light of stars and moon when the sky was clear enough to permit it. They hunted in this darkness, moving carefully across terrain they had learned during the brief autumn light, tracking the sounds and signs of animals that were also moving through the dark following their own logic of survival. Nansen kept a journal throughout this period, writing by the light of the blubber lamp when his hands were warm enough to hold a pen. The entries from those months reveal something of the psychological texture of the experience in a way that the bare facts of the situation cannot fully convey. He wrote about the silence, which he described as having a quality unlike any silence he'd known before, not peaceful in the way that quiet can be peaceful, but immense, as if the absence of sound were itself a presence. He wrote about the darkness with a mixture of acceptance and restlessness, noting that the mind adjusts to the absence of light in practical terms, but continues to reach for it in ways that are not entirely rational. He wrote about Johansen with respect and affection, noting the younger man's steadiness, his practical competence, his ability to perform the necessary tasks of their situation without complaint or drama. What Nansen's journal does not fully capture, and what can perhaps only be inferred from the circumstances, is the particular strain of two people being confined together in a space that's small for a period that long. Intimacy of that degree, enforced by circumstance rather than chosen, has a way of revealing everything about a person. There are no performances possible in a 2 by 3 stone hut in the Arctic winter. There is no privacy, no retreat, no moment of solitude. Every mood, every difficulty, every physical limitation is visible to the other person at all times. The relationship between two people in those conditions either becomes something durable and deeply functional, or it fractures, and the consequences of fracture in a situation with no possibility of separation or rescue are severe enough that both men had every reason to manage their relationship with great care. By most accounts, they managed it well. There were tensions, as there must be between any two people in such circumstances, but the particular combination of Nansen's intellectual intensity and Johansson's quiet, practical groundedness seems to have produced a working equilibrium rather than a destructive conflict. They developed routines. Routines are not exciting, but they are important in the way that foundations are important, not because they are interesting, but because everything else rests on them. They divided the tasks of their daily existence between them: hunting, cooking, maintaining the lamp, tending to equipment, and they kept to those divisions with the kind of consistency that gives structure to days that would otherwise blur into an undifferentiated continuity of cold and darkness and waiting. The waiting is perhaps the hardest thing to convey, not waiting for rescue, because rescue was not something either man entertained as a realistic prospect. No one knew where they were. No one in the entire world outside that small stone hut had any reliable information about whether Fridtjof Nansen and Hjalmar Johansen were alive. The Fram was somewhere in the polar basin, drifting on its own course, and the men aboard it knew that Nansen and Johansen had set out for Franz Josef Land. But knowing a destination and knowing an outcome are very different things. Back in Norway, Nansen's wife Eva and their young daughter Liv were living with the particular uncertainty of having a husband and father who had walked into one of the most remote places on Earth and not been heard from since. The world's newspapers had moved on from the story. The expedition had departed in 1893. By the winter of 1895 and into 1896, it had been long enough that the question of whether the men were alive was one that people were beginning to answer privately in the negative, even if they were not yet saying so publicly. Nansen and Johansen knew none of this. They knew only what was inside the hut and what was visible in the brief, dim intervals when they went outside. They knew the temperature, the state of the ice, the behaviour of the animals they hunted, the level of their food stores, and the rough position of the stars when the sky permitted observation. They counted time not by any external marker, but by the gradual, almost imperceptible shift in the quality of the darkness as winter moved toward its deepest point and then, slowly, began to reverse. The polar night does not end dramatically. It ends the way it began, incrementally, a few more minutes of twilight each day, a gradual warming at the horizon that is not yet sunrise but is the promise of one. It is, for anyone who has lived through the full depth of it, one of the most welcome things the world can offer. Nansen wrote about the first returning light with a feeling that is recognizable even from the distance of more than a century. It was not simply pleasant. It was, after the long darkness, something close to miraculous. The confirmation that the world was still turning, that the geometry of the solar system was still operating as expected, that spring would come because spring always comes, even here. The light returned slowly through February and into March of 1896, and with it came the gradual reawakening of possibility. The ice was still solid, the temperature was still brutal, but the horizon was visible again, and a visible horizon is a thing you can move toward. They had survived the winter. 9 months from their arrival in August of 1895 to the spring of 1896, they had maintained their health, their equipment, their food supply and their working relationship in conditions that had no precedent in the history of human endurance, or at least none that had been documented and survived. They were thinner. They were, by any objective measure, in a reduced physical state compared to when they had left the Fram. But they were alive and they were functional, and as the light returned, they began to prepare for the final phase of what had now become a journey of extraordinary length and complexity. The plan was straightforward in its outline, if not in its execution. They would travel south and west by ski and kayak, working their way through the islands of Franz Josef Land toward open water, and from open water they would attempt to reach Spitsbergen or some other point where they might find a ship or a settlement. It was, like the original plan to leave the Fram, a gamble with significant odds against it. They had no reliable map of the archipelago, they had limited supplies, they had no communication with the outside world and no way to signal their position to any vessel that might be in the area. What they had was the same thing they had relied on since February of 1895 when they had skied away from the Fram into the polar darkness, which was competence, preparation, and the particular quality of determination that does not loudly announce itself but simply continues. In late May of 1896 they broke camp. They dismantled what could be dismantled of the hut, packed their kayaks and sleds, and began moving. The islands of Franz Josef Land in spring are not easy terrain. The ice is beginning to break up in places, which creates leads of open water that must be crossed by kayak, while other areas remain locked in a way that requires the sleds. The transition between modes of travel is time-consuming and physically demanding, but they moved steadily, covering ground each day, navigating by observation and by the rough knowledge of the archipelago that Nansen had assembled from maps and from their own experience of the previous autumn. And somewhere ahead of them, though they did not yet know it, was a resolution to the long uncertainty of their situation that neither man could have predicted or planned for, because it depended not on their own skill or preparation, but on the simple, improbable fact that the Arctic, for all its size, had placed another human being within the range of what could be heard on a quiet day in late spring. The story of how two men who had been entirely alone for 9 months came back into contact with the rest of the human world is one that belongs to the next chapter of this journey, and it begins, as so many things in the Arctic begin, with a sound carried across the ice that was not the wind and not an animal, and that made one of the men stop walking and stand very still listening. It was a dog. That is the detail that tends to stop people when they first hear this story, because after everything, after the months of drifting ice and the polar dash and the record latitude and the walrus attack and the 9 months in a stone hut at the edge of the world, the thing that brought Fridtjof Nansen back into contact with human civilization was the sound of a dog barking somewhere across the ice of Franz Josef Land. Not a ship's horn, not a signal flare, not a carefully planned rendezvous. A dog doing what dogs do, announcing that something unfamiliar was nearby. It was June 17th, 1896. Nansen and Johansen had been moving steadily southward through the archipelago for several weeks since breaking camp in late May. The ice conditions had been difficult but manageable. They were thin, weathered, moving with the efficient and unhurried pace of men who had learned over many months not to waste energy on urgency they could not sustain. Their supplies were limited, their equipment was worn. Their beards by this point were extraordinary in the way that beards become when they are simply allowed to do whatever they want for the better part of a year without interference. They were, in other words, not the kind of men who would have been immediately recognizable as the most celebrated explorers in the world. Nansen heard the sound and stopped. He wrote about the moment later with a precision that suggests it hit him with force, the way any human sound hits a person who's been living outside the range of human sounds for a very long time. It was not the wind. The Arctic wind has its own voice, and a person who has spent months listening to it learns to distinguish it from other things. It was not any animal he associated with that landscape. It was a dog, and a dog meant a person, and a person meant a world that had continued existing, while he and Johansen had been suspended in their small stone room at the edge of it. He moved toward the sound. He left Johansen with the equipment and skied in the direction the barking was coming from, and what he found, emerging from the broken terrain of the archipelago on that June morning, was a man. His name was Frederick George Jackson. He was a British explorer, 33 years old, running his own expedition to Franz Josef Land under the patronage of a newspaper proprietor named Alfred Harmsworth. Jackson had arrived in the archipelago in 1894 with a team of men, a base camp called Cape Flora on Northbrook Island, and a plan to explore the region systematically over a period of several years. He was, in other words, entirely legitimately present in one of the most remote places on Earth, which is the kind of coincidence that sounds constructed when you describe it, but which was simply the result of two separate expeditions choosing the same corner of the Arctic at roughly the same time for reasons that made independent sense to each of them. Jackson was walking across the ice near his camp when he saw a figure approaching. The figure was moving on skis. It was wearing clothes that had clearly been through a great deal. It had, as noted, a considerable beard. Jackson later wrote that his first thought was that this must be one of his own men, though he could not account for which one or why the clothes looked so different. As the figure came closer, he recognised that this was not anyone from his expedition. This was a stranger, which in Franz Josef Land in June of 1896 was a category of person that did not easily explain itself. The two men met on the ice. Jackson extended his hand. He looked at the figure in front of him for a moment, taking in the weathered face and the remarkable beard and the general condition of a man who had been living at the extreme edge of what is survivable. And then he said something that has been quoted ever since, because it is one of those lines that manages to be both completely inadequate to the situation and also exactly right for it. He said, "I'm damned glad to see you." And then, because the face in front of him was beginning to resolve into something he thought he recognised from photographs and newspaper illustrations, he said, "Aren't you Nansen?" Nansen confirmed that he was. Jackson's response, as recorded in his own account of the expedition, was essentially one of barely contained disbelief. He had read about the Fram expedition. He knew that Nansen and Johansen had left the ship in February of 1895, more than a year earlier, and had not been heard from since. He knew, as the rest of the world knew, that their fate was unknown. And here, walking toward him across the ice of Franz Josef Land, was the man himself, alive, functional, and in possession of both kayaks and a sled, which suggested a journey of a kind that Jackson, who was himself no stranger to Arctic conditions, found difficult to immediately process. He brought Nansen back to the Cape Flora base camp. Johansen was retrieved. The two men were given food, real food, the kind that comes from a proper expedition kitchen rather than from a blubber lamp and whatever animal had been unfortunate enough to come within range of a rifle. They were given clean clothes. They were given the particular luxury of being in a space that was large enough to stand up in without difficulty, which after 9 months in a 2x3 metre stone hut is not a small thing. They were also given news of the world, news of Norway, news of the Fram, which was, as far as anyone knew, still somewhere in the Arctic, still drifting, still unaccounted for. Jackson's expedition had been at Cape Flora long enough to have received some communications through supply ships, and Nansen was able to piece together a picture of what had been happening in the world during the long months of his absence. He learned that his wife Eva and his daughter Liv were well. He learned that Norway was following the expedition with sustained and anxious attention. He learned, in other words, that the world had not forgotten him, even if it had begun to quietly fear the worst. Jackson's ship, the Windward, was due to arrive at Cape Flora on its annual supply run. It arrived in late July, and on August 7th, 1896, Nansen and Johansen boarded it. The Windward carried them south and west, out of Franz Josef Land and back toward the Norwegian coast. On August 13th, 1896, they arrived at Vardø, a small port town on the northeastern tip of Norway, the first Norwegian soil either man had stood on since June of 1893, more than 3 years earlier. The reception at Vardø was the beginning of something that would only grow larger as they moved south. The telegrams went out immediately. The news travelled fast in the manner of 1896 fast, which meant that within hours the major newspapers of Europe and North America were carrying the information that Nansen and Johansen were alive. that they had reached 86 degrees 13.6 minutes north, that they had survived a winter alone in Franz Josef Land, and that they were on their way home. The world, which had been holding something in reserve, something between hope and resignation, released it all at once. But there is another part of this story happening simultaneously, entirely out of contact with Nansen, entirely unaware of the meeting on the ice or the arrival at Vardø, and it is in some ways the more quietly extraordinary of the two threads. Because while Nansen was shaking Frederick Jackson's hand on June 17th, the Fram was still in the ice. She had been drifting for nearly 3 years. Otto Sverdrup and the 12 remaining crew members had continued the scientific program, continued their observations, continued their routines, continued being the version of the expedition that did not have a dramatic story to tell, but simply did the work of existing in the Arctic for an extended period without breaking down, falling apart, or losing anyone. The Fram's drift had continued through 1895 and into 1896, moving generally northward and then westward through the polar basin, exactly as Nansen's original hypothesis had predicted. The ship had reached its own farthest north at approximately 85 degrees 57 minutes north in November of 1895, which is remarkable in itself. A ship frozen in ice drifting to within a few degrees of the pole, while its captain was somewhere in Franz Josef Land building a stone hut. The ice had continued to pressure the hull through the winter, and the hull had continued to rise and flex and absorb the pressure, exactly as Colin Archer had designed it to do. The windmill had continued generating electricity. The dogs had continued being dogs. The men had continued reading from the 600-book library and publishing the Framjar, and rotating through cooking duties and playing cards in the lamplight while the Arctic winter did its worst around them. By the spring of 1896, the drift had carried the Fram far enough west and south that the ice was beginning to thin. Sverdrup and the crew could see that the conditions were changing. The pressure ridges were less frequent. The leads were opening. The character of the ice was shifting from the dense, compressed pack of the deep polar basin to the looser, more dynamic ice of the margins. On August 13th, 1896, the same day Nansen stepped onto the dock at Vardø, the Fram broke free of the ice. 3 years and almost 11 months after she'd been deliberately steered into the pack north of Siberia, she was a free ship again, her engines running, her hull intact, her crew of 13 men all present and alive, and almost certainly experiencing a kind of relief that is difficult to describe in any language. Sverdrup set course for Spitsbergen. On August 20th, 1896, the Fram arrived at Skjervet in the Spitsbergen archipelago. The crew sent telegrams. The news went out. The Fram had returned. Consider the arithmetic of this for a moment, because it is the kind of coincidence that the Arctic seems to produce specifically to make people question whether the word coincidence is doing enough work. Nansen arrived in Norway on August 13th. The Fram broke free on August the 13th. The Fram arrived in Spitsbergen on August the 20th. Nansen and the Fram crew were reunited in Norway within days of each other, after 3.5 years of complete separation, after 2 entirely independent survival stories that had unfolded in parallel with no communication, no coordination, and no certainty on either side that the other was still alive. The reunion happened in Tromsø, the northern Norwegian port city, on August 21st, 1896. Nansen boarded the Fram for the first time since he had skied away from her in the polar darkness of February 1895. He walked through the ship he had designed and commissioned and entrusted to Sverdrup and 11 other men, and those men were there, all of them, every single one. Not a single member of the crew had been lost. In the entire 3-year expedition, which had included the most deliberately extreme Arctic voyage in history, 2 men skiing to a record latitude and spending 9 months alone in a stone hut, and a 3-year ice drift through the polar basin, no one had died. The ship had not been crushed. The hull had held. The design had worked. The hypothesis had been correct. It is worth pausing on that last point, because in the midst of the human drama, the meetings and the reunions and the telegrams and the relief, it is easy to lose sight of what the Fram's drift actually represented as a scientific event. Nansen had proposed, on the basis of a piece of wreckage found on a Greenland beach in 1884, that a transpolar current moved through the Arctic basin. He had proposed to test this hypothesis by building a ship capable of surviving the ice and allowing it to be carried by that current. The scientific community had told him, with varying degrees of politeness, that this was a plan designed by someone who did not fully appreciate the difference between a hypothesis and a death wish. And he had been right. The current was real. It moved in the direction he had predicted. It carried the Fram from the New Siberian Islands to Spitsbergen in a drift that matched, in its general shape and direction, the path he had sketched out years before in a proposal that his colleagues had called illogical. That is not a small thing. That is a scientist committing entirely to a theory in the most literal possible way, staking his life and the lives of 12 other men on the correctness of his reasoning, and being vindicated not by a controlled experiment in a laboratory, but by 3 years of ice and darkness, and the survival of a wooden ship in conditions that had destroyed every other vessel that had encountered them. The data the Fram brought back was equally significant, and it would take years to fully analyse and publish. The continuous oceanographic measurements collected during the drift would reveal things about the Arctic basin that no one had been able to determine before. The depth soundings would show that the Arctic Ocean was not the shallow sea that some had imagined, but a deep basin in places exceeding 3,000 metres, with a complex underwater topography that bore no resemblance to the featureless floor that earlier theories had assumed. The water temperature and salinity measurements would provide the first systematic picture of how Arctic water masses were structured and how they moved. The meteorological records would add 3 years of continuous data from the centre of the polar basin, a region where no observations had ever been made before and where none would be made again for many decades. And there was, of course, the matter of the farthest north record. 86 degrees, 13.6 minutes north. It was a number that would stand for 8 years until the American explorer Robert Peary pushed past it in 1900, and it was reached not by a large, well-supplied national expedition with a fleet of support ships, but by 2 men on skis with 28 dogs and 3 months of food, operating entirely on their own judgment in the middle of a frozen ocean. The record was almost incidental to everything else the expedition had accomplished, but it was the number that the newspapers printed because numbers like that are easy to understand, and the rest of it is harder to explain in a headline. The Windward carried Nansen and Johansen home. The Fram carried Sverdrup and the crew home, and Norway, a country that was at that moment in a tense political relationship with Sweden and moving steadily toward the independence it would formally declare in 1905, received them both with a fervour that went well beyond ordinary celebration. Nansen was already famous before the expedition. He had crossed Greenland on skis in 1888 and written a book about it that had made him a public figure across Europe. But the Fram expedition transformed him into something larger, a symbol of what Norwegian determination and Norwegian science and Norwegian seamanship could achieve. The crowds that greeted the ships in Christiania were enormous. The speeches were long. The celebrations lasted for days. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, if you look at the photographs from that August and September of 1896, you can see in Nansen's face something that is not quite the expression of a man who is purely happy to be celebrated. It is something more complicated than that. The face of a man who has been somewhere that very few people have been, who has spent 9 months in a stone hut at the edge of the world, who has skied across a frozen ocean in the dark, who has killed and eaten his own dogs to survive, who has lain next to another man in a space barely large enough to turn over in, and counted the days by the quality of the darkness. That experience does not simply dissolve in the warmth of a harbour welcome. It stays with a person. It changes the scale of things. It makes ordinary rooms feel large and ordinary problems feel manageable, but it also makes certain kinds of noise and certain kinds of celebration feel slightly beside the point. What had been proven, and what the data would spend years confirming, was not simply that a man could survive the Arctic. That had been proven before, at great cost. What had been proven was that the Arctic could be understood, that it operated according to principles, that a current was a current and a hull was a hull, and a hypothesis was a thing worth testing with your life if you believed in it enough and had built something worthy of the test, that science and endurance and careful preparation could accomplish together what courage alone had repeatedly failed to achieve. The Fram sat in the harbour, her hull scarred and her paint worn and her rigging weathered, but her structure entirely sound, the most tested wooden ship in the history of polar exploration, and the story of what she had done and what the men aboard her had done was only beginning to be told in full. The scientific papers would take years, the books would take time, the implications for oceanography and meteorology and our understanding of the polar basin would unfold over decades. But the first chapter of that telling was already underway, and the world that had watched the Fram sail north in 1893 and then waited and worried and gradually begun to fear the worst, was now listening to the answer come back, slowly and completely, in the form of data and testimony and the simple, extraordinary fact that every man who had left had returned. The scientific results, when they were finally compiled and published in full, were considerable enough to justify the expedition on their own terms, independent of the drama of the polar dash or the extraordinary coincidence of the two homecomings arriving within days of each other. Nansen understood this. He was a scientist before he was an adventurer, and while the newspapers were printing the record latitude and the dramatic details of the stone hut and the walrus attack, he was already thinking about what the data meant and how to present it in a form that would be useful to people who had never set foot anywhere near the Arctic. The 2-volume account he published in 1897, under the title Farthest North, was not simply a narrative of the expedition. It was a document of what had been learned, written in a style that managed to be both scientifically precise and genuinely readable, which is a combination that is considerably harder to achieve than it sounds. The book became an immediate success across Europe and North America, translated into multiple languages, read by explorers and scientists and ordinary readers who had followed the expedition's long silence with a mixture of hope and dread. But the deeper scientific legacy was not in the popular account. It was in the technical papers and the oceanographic data sets that Nansen and his colleagues spent years analysing after the return. The measurements the Fram collected during its 3-year drift were unlike anything that had existed before, for the simple reason that no instrument had ever spent 3 years in the middle of the polar basin recording conditions continuously. Previous Arctic expeditions had gathered data in fragments at the edges of the ice during brief summer seasons under the pressure of survival. The Fram had drifted slowly and involuntarily through the heart of the basin, and at regular intervals, every 4 hours in many cases, the crew had taken readings. Water temperatures at various depths, salinity measurements, atmospheric pressure, wind speed and direction, air temperature, the depth of the ocean floor beneath them, measured by sounding lines lowered through holes cut in the ice. These were not dramatic activities. They were quiet, repetitive, careful work performed in the dark and the cold by men who understood that the value of a measurement depends entirely on the consistency with which it is taken, and that consistency, maintained across 3 years of confinement and boredom and occasional terror, produced something genuinely new. One of the most significant findings was the depth of the Arctic Ocean itself. Before the Fram expedition, there was no reliable data on how deep the polar basin was. Some geographers assumed it was relatively shallow, a kind of broad submarine shelf extending from the continental margins. The sounding measurements the Fram collected told a very different story. In places, the ocean floor lay more than 3,800 metres below the surface. In one location, a sounding reached approximately 3,900 metres before touching bottom. This was not a shallow sea. It was a deep basin, comparable in depth to significant portions of the Atlantic and Pacific, with an underwater topography that was complex and varied, and bore no resemblance to the flat, featureless floor that the shallow sea theory had imagined. This single finding had implications that extended well beyond the Arctic. It changed the way oceanographers thought about the structure of the polar regions and the way ocean circulation models needed to account for the high north. A shallow basin and a deep basin behave very differently in terms of how water moves through them, how heat is distributed, how currents are generated and sustained. Knowing the actual depth was not a minor detail. It was a foundational piece of information that every subsequent model of Arctic oceanography would need to incorporate. The transpolar drift current itself was confirmed in the most direct way possible by the simple fact that the Fram had drifted across the polar basin exactly as Nansen had predicted it would. The debris from the Jeannette had not washed up on the coast of Greenland by accident or by some local anomaly. It had been carried by a persistent, systematic current that moved through the basin from the Siberian side toward the North Atlantic, driven by a combination of wind patterns and the rotation of the Earth. The Fram's track across the ice, recorded day by day in the ship's log, provided the first direct measurement of that current speed, direction, and consistency. It moved slowly, roughly 1.5 miles to 2 miles per day on average, with variations caused by wind and the irregular resistance of the ice. But it moved, reliably and continuously, in the direction that Nansen had theorized from the evidence of a few waterlogged planks found on a Greenland beach 13 years earlier. The confirmation of the transpolar drift was not just a vindication of Nansen's reasoning. It was the foundation of a branch of oceanographic research that would develop steadily through the 20th century and remains active today as scientists study how the Arctic circulation system interacts with the broader patterns of global ocean movement, and how changes in that system might affect climate across the Northern Hemisphere. The open polar sea theory, that persistent and remarkably durable idea that a navigable, ice-free ocean existed near the pole, warmed by some mechanism that its proponents never managed to identify convincingly, was disproved as thoroughly as a theory can be disproved. The Fram had spent 3 years drifting through the region where the open polar sea was supposed to be. The crew had taken continuous temperature measurements. They had recorded the state of the ice around them. They had lowered instruments through the ice to measure what lay beneath. There was no warm current rising from below. There was no open water beyond the pack. There was ice, and beneath the ice there was very cold, very deep water, and the temperature gradient moved in exactly the wrong direction for any version of the open polar sea to exist. The theory had sent ships into danger for decades, most catastrophically in the case of expeditions that pushed north expecting to find navigable water and instead found crushing pack ice. After the Fram's data was published, the open polar sea ceased to be a serious scientific proposition. It had taken a 3-year drift and 3 years of careful measurement to kill it, but it was dead, and the Arctic could now be understood on its own terms rather than through the lens of a wishful hypothesis. Nansen himself was careful about how he presented these findings. He was not a man who overstated his conclusions, and the scientific papers he produced, along with his colleague Henrik Mohn and others, were notable for their precision and their acknowledgement of what remained uncertain. There was still much that the Fram's data could not answer. The basin was deep, but its full topography was unknown. The drift current had been measured along one track, but how it varied across the basin was still unclear. The relationship between the Arctic circulation and the broader Atlantic system was understood in outline but not in detail. Nansen presented what the data showed and was explicit about what it did not yet show. This was good science, and it was recognised as such. The oceanographic community received the Fram's findings seriously, and the data sets were used and cited for decades after the expedition returned. What made this scientifically unusual, and what is worth pausing on for a moment, is the way the expedition managed to be simultaneously a feat of extreme physical endurance and a rigorous scientific program. These two things are not always easy to combine. The demands of survival in the Arctic are severe enough to crowd out almost everything else. Previous expeditions had sometimes managed to collect observations during their ordeals, but the conditions rarely permitted the kind of systematic, continuous measurement that produces genuinely useful data. The Fram's design and Nansen's planning had specifically addressed this problem. The ship was comfortable enough by polar standards that the crew could maintain regular scientific routines without being consumed entirely by the effort of keeping warm and alive. The windmill provided electricity for light and heat. The provisions were sufficient and well chosen. The medical preparation, which Nansen had taken seriously after studying the dietary failures of previous expeditions, meant that the crew remained healthy throughout the drift. No deaths, no serious illness, no scurvy, the disease that had devastated so many earlier polar crews, because Nansen had ensured that the diet included sufficient fresh meat and that the men understood why it mattered. The result was that the scientific program could be maintained day after day, year after year, in conditions that would have made scientific work impossible for any expedition that had not been as carefully prepared. The Fram itself went on to a second life after the expedition returned, which is perhaps the most unusual part of an already unusual story. The ship that had been built specifically to survive being frozen in polar ice, that had been designed with a rounded hull and walls more than a metre thick and internal bracing like a skeleton, turned out to be the most capable polar vessel in existence, and other explorers recognised this quickly. Otto Sverdrup, who had commanded the Fram during the long drift after Nansen and Johansen departed, led his own expedition on the same ship from 1898 to 1902, exploring the Canadian Arctic archipelago and mapping large areas of territory that had never been charted. The Fram performed exactly as it had before, surviving ice pressure and Arctic conditions that would have destroyed a conventional vessel. Then, in 1910, the ship was chosen for perhaps the most famous polar expedition of the early 20th century. Roald Amundsen, another Norwegian, sailed the Fram south to Antarctica, and from its base the expedition set out on the journey that would reach the South Pole on December 14, 1911, the first human beings to stand at the southernmost point on Earth. The ship that Nansen had built to drift across the Arctic carried the men who first reached the Antarctic. It had travelled farther into both polar regions than any other vessel in history, a record it still holds. The Fram now sits in Oslo, in a museum built specifically to house it, the Fram Museet on the Big Doy Peninsula. If you visit, which is a thing that is entirely possible to do on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, with a transit card and a light jacket, you can walk around the hull and look up at the rounded shape that Colin Archer designed to rise under pressure rather than crack. You can stand on the deck and look down into the hold where 13 men lived for 3 years. You can see the library where 600 books waited for readers during the long polar darkness, and the small galley where meals were prepared on a rotation, and the bunks where men slept with the sound of ice groaning against the hull a few centimetres from their heads. The ship is well preserved, and standing inside it has the particular quality of old wooden vessels, a sense of the space being both smaller and more real than you expected. It is hard to look at the Fram in its museum and not feel something about the specific dimensions of what those men chose to do. The hull is not enormous, the living quarters are not spacious, the distance between the decision to sail north and the possibility of never returning was not large, measured in planks and provisions and the correctness of a theory about a current. The scientific legacy, the oceanographic data, the disproof of the open polar sea, the confirmation of the transpolar drift, the depth measurements of the Arctic basin, these things fed into the developing discipline of oceanography through the late 19th and early 20th centuries in ways that are difficult to trace precisely, but are real and documented. Nansen himself continued to work in the field. He developed methods for measuring ocean water masses that became standard tools in physical oceanography, and the concept of the Ekman layer, the layer of ocean water affected by wind-driven currents, emerged partly from theoretical work that Nansen and the Swedish physicist Vagn Velfrid Ekman developed in conversation with each other, prompted by observations from the Fram expedition. Nansen had noticed that the ice did not drift in exactly the direction of the wind, but at an angle to it, and he mentioned this to Ekman, who worked out the mathematical explanation. The result was a foundational piece of physical oceanography that is still taught today. A casual observation from a man drifting across the Arctic in a wooden ship became, through the work of a theorist who listened carefully, a permanent contribution to the science of how oceans move. It is worth saying plainly what all of this adds up to, because it is easy, in the telling of a story this dramatic, to let the human adventure overshadow the intellectual achievement, or to let the intellectual achievement overshadow the human experience, when in fact the two things were not separate. The Fram expedition worked because Nansen was both a scientist and an explorer, because he trusted data and also trusted his own physical courage, because he planned carefully and also improvised brilliantly when the plan required it. The expedition was not simply a feat of endurance that happened to collect some useful observations along the way. It was a designed scientific program that required extraordinary endurance to execute. The science and the survival were not two different stories happening simultaneously. They were the same story told in two different languages, and yet, for all of that, what most people know about the Fram expedition, if they know anything, is the record latitude and the dramatic image of two men on skis in the middle of a frozen ocean. Which is understandable, because 86 degrees north is a number that needs no explanation, and two men alone on the ice is an image that requires no scientific background to feel. The deeper story, the drift current and the depth soundings and the disproof of a century-old theory requires a little more patience to appreciate. But it is the deeper story that explains why the expedition mattered beyond its moment, why the Fram's 3 years in the ice were not simply a survival story, but a contribution to a body of knowledge that would shape how scientists understood the polar regions for generations to come. The record was broken eventually, as records always are. The data has never stopped being useful. There is one more dimension to the expedition's legacy that belongs in this part of the telling, and it is not scientific but personal. Nansen came home from the Arctic in August of 1896 as a celebrated man, a national hero, a figure whose name was known across Europe and North America. He was 34 years old. He had reached the farthest north any human being had ever stood. He had survived 9 months alone on a frozen island. He had proven his theory correct in the most definitive way imaginable. He had returned every man he had taken north. And he was, in the photographs from that autumn, clearly a man who had been somewhere that the celebration around him could not quite reach. The scale of what the Arctic had shown him, the immensity of the basin, the depth of the darkness, the slowness of the ice, the particular quality of a silence that has no human content at all, does not simply release a person back into ordinary life without leaving something behind. What it left in Nansen was not damage, exactly, but a kind of recalibration, a sense of proportion that the noise of celebration could not entirely displace. He would carry that recalibration with him into everything that came next, and what came next was, in its own way, as remarkable as what had come before, though it would take a different form entirely, one that had nothing to do with ice or latitude or the farthest point north, and everything to do with the question of what a person does with the rest of a life after they have already done the thing they will always be remembered for. That question, what does a person do with the rest of a life after they have already done the thing they will always be remembered for, is not a small one. Most people never face it. Most people move through their years accumulating experience gradually, without any single moment that towers over everything else. Nansen was 34 years old when he stepped off the Windward in Vardø, and the thing he would always be remembered for was already behind him. The ice was behind him. The record was behind him. The theory had been proven. The ship had come home. The data had been collected. What remained was the rest of his life, which turned out to be 34 more years, and which turned out to matter in ways that had nothing to do with latitude or longitude or the distance to the North Pole. He tried for a while to remain in science. He continued his oceanographic work, publishing papers, developing methods, corresponding with other researchers. He took part in Atlantic research cruises in the early 1900s. He was appointed Norway's first ambassador to Great Britain when Norway dissolved its union with Sweden in 1905, a diplomatic role that surprised people who thought of him only as an explorer. But that suited a man who had spent years negotiating the gap between a bold idea and a skeptical world. He was good at it, in the way that people who have genuinely staked their lives on a belief tend to be good at making a case for things they think are true. He knew how to be patient. He knew how to wait. He had, after all, spent 3 years drifting. But it was the First World War and its aftermath that redirected Nansen most completely. The war produced displacement on a scale that Europe had not seen in modern memory. Millions of people were separated from their homes, their countries, their legal identities. Prisoners of war stranded in foreign nations. Refugees without papers, without status, without any official recognition that they existed as people with rights. The League of Nations, newly formed and struggling to address problems it had no existing tools to solve, appointed Nansen as its first High Commissioner for Refugees in 1921. He was 59 years old, and he took the role with the same directness he had brought to polar planning. The problem he faced was, in its own way, as seemingly intractable as the problem of crossing the Arctic. There were approximately 450,000 prisoners of war still stranded across Europe and Russia after the armistice. Men who could not return home because no mechanism existed to move them, feed them, or verify their identities across borders that had shifted or collapsed. Nansen organised the repatriation of around 427,000 of them within 2 years, working through a combination of negotiation, logistics, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had learned not to be deterred by problems that seemed too large to solve. He had, after all, once looked at a map of the Arctic Ocean and decided the solution was to drive a ship into the ice and wait. Then came the Russian famine of 1921 and 1922, in which an estimated 5 million people died. Nansen organised international relief efforts, raising money and coordinating food shipments, in the face of political resistance and donor fatigue. He was not always successful, and he knew it. The scale of suffering was beyond what any single effort could address, and he said so plainly, without pretending that the work he could do was equal to the work that needed doing. That honesty, the willingness to acknowledge the size of the gap between what was possible and what was needed, was characteristic of the man. He had never pretended the Arctic was smaller than it was. He did not pretend that human suffering was easier to address than it actually was. The thing he is perhaps most practically remembered for, in the humanitarian work, is the Nansen passport, introduced in 1922. The problem it addressed was specific and devastating. After the Russian Revolution, approximately 800,000 Russian emigrants found themselves stateless, stripped of their citizenship by the Soviet government, and not yet recognised as citizens of any other country. Without valid identity documents, they could not legally cross borders, could not work in most countries, could not access basic legal protections. They existed in a bureaucratic void. Nansen proposed a simple solution, an internationally recognised identity certificate that stateless people could use in place of a national passport. The certificate bore his name almost immediately, because it was so associated with his advocacy. By the time the system was fully developed, the Nansen passport was recognised by 52 countries, and it had been extended beyond Russian emigrants to Armenian refugees fleeing the aftermath of genocide, and eventually to other displaced populations. Something in the range of 450,000 people received Nansen passports during the 1920s. It was, in its way, a piece of engineering, not a ship, but a document, designed to solve a specific problem that the existing system could not address. The Nobel Committee recognised all of this with the Nobel Peace Prize in 1922. The citation described his work for the repatriation of prisoners, his famine relief efforts, and his work for refugees. Nansen accepted it with the same composure he brought to most things, and donated a significant portion of the prize money to relief efforts. He continued working until he died on May 13th, 1930, at his home Polhøgda outside Oslo at the age of 68. He had been preparing for another day's work when his heart gave out. He was found in his chair, which is either poignant or simply true, depending on how you prefer to read a life. What is striking, when you hold the two halves of Nansen's life next to each other, is how different they look on the surface and how similar they are underneath. The polar explorer and the refugee advocate seem like different people. One is defined by cold and isolation and the pushing of physical limits. The other is defined by bureaucracy and diplomacy and the patient negotiation of human systems. But both halves were animated by the same thing, a willingness to look at a problem that other people had declared unsolvable, identify the mechanism that might actually work and then commit to it completely, without waiting for permission or consensus or certainty. The transpolar drift was real. The Nansen passport was possible. The prisoners could be repatriated. The famine victims could be reached. None of these things were obvious to the people who had been looking at the problems before Nansen arrived. All of them became obvious, or at least achievable, once he started working. There is something in that pattern worth sitting with for a moment. The man who spent 3 years drifting in Arctic ice, trusting a theory that almost no one believed, spent the second half of his life trying to reconnect people who had been cut loose from the systems that should have held them. He had experienced a very particular kind of isolation, chosen, temporary and purposeful but genuine, and he seems to have emerged from it with a deep sensitivity to what it costs a person to be separated from the world they belong to. That may be reading too much into the arc of a life, or it may be exactly the right amount. The Fram itself outlasted all of this. After returning from the Arctic in August of 1896, the ship was refitted and used again. Otto Sverdrup took it on a second expedition to the Canadian Arctic from 1898 to 1902, mapping enormous areas of the archipelago north of Canada, charting islands that had never been recorded, covering territory so remote that some of it was not revisited by researchers for decades. Then, in 1910, Roald Amundsen used the Fram for his expedition to Antarctica, the one that ended with Amundsen's team reaching the South Pole on December 14, 1911, becoming the first humans to stand there. The Fram carried Amundsen and his men south just as it had once carried Nansen north. It was the same ship, the same rounded hull, the same thick walls, the same basic design that Colin Archer had drawn in the early 1890s, with the specific purpose of surviving ice pressure. It survived ice pressure in the Arctic. It survived the Southern Ocean. It made it to Antarctica and back. When Amundsen returned from the South Pole, the Fram was retired. It had travelled farther north than any other ship in history and farther south than any other ship in history, which is a distinction that sounds almost too neat to be true but is simply what happened. The ship was preserved, eventually moved to a purpose-built museum on the Bygdøy Peninsula in Oslo, where it sits today inside a large A-frame building constructed specifically around it. The Fram Museum opened in 1936. The ship has not moved since. It is the farthest travelled wooden vessel in history, which is a record it holds without any competition, because no other wooden ship has come remotely close to what it did in either direction. Standing near the Fram today, as visitors do in large numbers every year, the ship communicates something that is hard to put into words but easy to feel. It is not enormous. It is not sleek. It does not look like a vessel designed for speed or elegance. It looks like what it was, a ship designed for survival, built to be squeezed and to rise, built to last longer than anyone should reasonably expect wood to last in those conditions. The hull is dark with age. The proportions are unusual, wide relative to its length, round-bottomed, not quite like anything else. It looks, in a word, determined. Not heroic in the way that word usually gets used, not dramatic or decorated, just deeply, practically committed to the task it was built for. There is something appropriate about the fact that the ship still exists, and that you can go and look at it. Most of the objects from that era of exploration are gone. The ships that were crushed by ice are gone. The equipment that failed is gone. The provisions that ran out are gone. The Fram remains, not because it was lucky, but because it was designed to remain, because the people who built it understood the conditions they were sending it into, and built accordingly. That is not a small thing. It is in fact the central thing. The Fram expedition succeeded not because Nansen was reckless, or because fortune smiled at the right moment, but because the preparation was serious, the theory was correct, the ship was built to the right specification, and the men aboard it were chosen carefully and led well. The adventure was real, but it was not accidental, and yet, for all of that careful preparation, there is something about the Fram expedition that exceeds the sum of its planning. Something that belongs to the category of things that cannot be fully accounted for by logistics and theory. 2 men alone in a stone hut on a frozen island for 9 months, with no contact with the outside world, no certainty of rescue, burning blubber for light, eating polar bear and walrus through the long darkness, and then walking out in the spring and finding, by what seems like an improbable coincidence, another human being in that empty landscape. The Fram breaking free of the ice at almost exactly the moment it was predicted to, arriving in Spitsbergen within days of Nansen's own return to Norway, as if the 2 parts of the expedition had been coordinating by some means that had nothing to do with radios or signals. These things belong to the expedition's story in a way that planning cannot fully explain. They are the part that makes the whole thing feel, in retrospect, like it was always going to work out, which of course it was not, and which is precisely why it still feels remarkable. Nansen spent the rest of his life after the Arctic trying to help people who had been cut loose from the world they belonged to. The Fram sits in Oslo, the farthest travelled wooden ship in history, holding inside its thick walls the memory of 3 years in the ice, and the record Nansen and Johansen reached on April 7th, 1895, 86 degrees, 13.6 minutes north, stood for 5 years until Luigi Amedeo, Duke of the Abruzzi, pushed it slightly farther in 1900. The pole itself was not reached until 1909, by Robert Peary's expedition, though that claim has been disputed ever since. What is not disputed is that Nansen's drift gave later expeditions the knowledge they needed about the Arctic basin, its depth, its currents, its actual character. He did not reach the pole. He did something more durable. He described the place accurately. There is a final image worth leaving with, and it is not dramatic. It is the Fram, sitting in its museum in Oslo, neither sinking nor fleeing, still preserved. The hull that was designed to be squeezed by ice and rise above it, still rising in its way, above the years that have passed since it was last in the water. Nansen's idea was that if you built something strong enough and trusted a current that was real and committed to the drift completely, the ice would eventually release you. He was right. The ship came home, the men came home, the data came home, and the theory that launched the whole thing, that wreckage from a crushed ship could drift from Siberia to Greenland and tell you something true about the way the Arctic moves, turned out to be not just correct, but foundational. It is a particular kind of courage that looks, from the outside, like stubbornness. The courage to trust a theory that almost no one believes, to build something worthy of it, to sail north into the ice with 12 other people and an idea, and to wait. Not passively, not helplessly, but with purpose and patience, and the quiet confidence that the current is real, the drift is real, the ship will hold. And when the ice finally loosens its grip, to sail home with something that matters, not just a record, not just a story, something that changes permanently and precisely what we know about the world. Sleep well, wherever you are tonight. The ice is still drifting up there, slowly, as it always has, carrying whatever happens to be frozen into it toward wherever the current decides to go. And somewhere in Oslo, in a large building shaped like an upturned hull, a wooden ship sits in the quiet, having already been where it needed to go.